Enough! You are sentenced to life without parole!
Oh, that's rich. Beautiful. Bravo. Bye-bye now. Let's go.
Get your hands off! This isn't over! I'll come back for every single one of you!
The playground at Riverside Elementary should have been empty. November 28, 2024 was a half day, the start of Thanksgiving break, and every child in Billings, Montana had gone home. Every child but one. Behind the bright plastic slide, tucked into the shadow of the wooden fort, 8-year-old Diego Sanchez lay still. His Pokemon backpack, the one his mother had zipped that morning, was still strapped to his back. His neck showed what had happened. The bruises were clear. Someone had strangled him there, in the place where he should have been safest. Marcus Webb, a 43-year-old janitor at Riverside Elementary, had been locking up the equipment shed when he noticed a teenage boy hurrying away from the playground area, tugging at his disheveled clothing and repeatedly wiping his hands on his jeans. The teenager's face was flushed, his breathing labored, as if he'd been exerting himself, and there was something about his expression, a mixture of panic and satisfaction, that immediately struck Marcus as disturbing. It wasn't until 20 minutes later, when Marcus was making his final rounds before leaving, that he discovered Diego's body and realized the significance of what he had witnessed. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The first police officers arrived within minutes of Marcus's frantic 911 call, securing the area with yellow tape and calling for additional units as darkness fell completely over the playground. Detective Richard Thompson, a 15-year veteran of the Billings Police Department's Homicide Division, arrived on scene at 6:42 p.m., his breath visible in the cold Montana air as he ducked under the crime scene tape. The medical examiner confirmed what appeared obvious from the marks on Diego's neck. The cause of death was manual strangulation, with the time of death estimated between 4:30 and 5:15 p.m., precisely when Marcus Webb had observed the teenage boy leaving the area. Detective Thompson stood silently, taking in the scene, noting the boy's positioned body behind the playground equipment, hidden enough to avoid immediate discovery, but not concealed with any particular skill or effort. The detective's experienced eyes caught several details immediately. No signs of a prolonged struggle, indicating the killer had overwhelmed the child quickly. The victim's belongings were undisturbed, ruling out robbery. And most tellingly, the position of the bruising suggested the killer had strangled Diego face to face, watching as the life drained from the child's eyes. Thompson knew from the outset this wasn't a random act of violence or a crime of opportunity. This was personal, deliberate, and executed with a chilling purposefulness that was uncommon in juvenile crime. By midnight, the crime scene technicians had collected all available evidence, and Diego's body had been transported to the county morgue for a complete autopsy. Detective Thompson had conducted preliminary interviews with Marcus Webb, school staff who had been present for the half-day session, and the devastated parents of Diego Sanchez. The Sanchez family lived just 3 blocks from the school, and Diego had been permitted to walk home alone only recently, a sign of growing independence that had now resulted in unimaginable tragedy. Maria Sanchez, Diego's mother, had collapsed upon hearing the news and had to be sedated by paramedics, while his father, Carlos, sat stone-faced, answering Thompson's questions in a hollow voice between calls to relatives. Diego's older brother, 14-year-old Miguel, had been at basketball practice when the murder occurred, his alibi immediately confirmed by his coach and teammates. When questioned about anyone who might want to harm his little brother, Miguel initially seemed confused, unable to imagine who would target an 8-year-old child. As Thompson's questioning continued, however, Miguel mentioned a recent altercation with a junior at the high school, a boy named Nathan Cooper who had bullied several freshmen, including Miguel. Miguel had stood up to Nathan 2 weeks prior, embarrassing him in front of his friends, and Nathan had promised that Miguel would regret it. Detective Thompson made a note of Nathan Cooper's name, but kept his expression neutral as Miguel described the incident. Thompson knew that teenage conflicts were common but rarely escalated to the murder of a sibling, yet the timing and the specific threat of making Miguel regret it resonated with the detective's understanding of revenge-motivated crimes. When Thompson asked for a description of Nathan Cooper, Miguel's description matched the teenager Marcus Webb had seen leaving the playground, tall, lean, with light brown hair, styled in an undercut, typically wearing dark-colored clothing. By dawn on November 29th, Detective Thompson had compiled enough preliminary evidence to justify bringing Nathan Cooper in for questioning. The detective had run a background check on the Cooper family and discovered that Nathan's parents, James and Elizabeth Cooper, were both prominent attorneys in Billings. James specialized in corporate law at a prestigious firm, while Elizabeth worked as a public defender. Thompson knew that questioning a minor from an influential family would require careful handling, particularly with parents who understood the legal system intimately. The sun was just breaking over the horizon when Thompson dispatched 2 officers to the Cooper residence, instructing them to request that Nathan and his parents come to the station voluntarily for questioning. Thompson wanted to observe Nathan's reaction to being approached by police, knowing that first responses could be telling, particularly in someone young enough to not have fully developed the ability to mask their emotions. As Thompson waited for word from his officers, he reviewed what they knew about Nathan Cooper. 16 years, old junior at Central High School, no criminal record, but several disciplinary incidents at school for fighting and intimidation of other students. Marcus Webb sat in Thompson's office, sipping coffee and going over his statement for the 3rd time, his hand still shaking slightly as he described seeing Nathan Cooper leaving the playground. "I've seen him around before," Marcus explained, his voice low and troubled. "He's one of those kids who thinks the rules don't apply to him, always leaving trash around for me to clean up, making messes on purpose." Thompson nodded, making notes as Marcus continued to describe Nathan's demeanor that evening, the unusual agitation, the compulsive hand-wiping, the way he'd looked over his shoulder repeatedly as he walked quickly away from the playground area. Parents began arriving at Riverside Elementary, having heard about the murder on morning news broadcasts or through frantic text messages from other parents. School officials announced that classes would be canceled, and crisis counselors were being brought in to help students process the tragedy when school resumed. Detective Thompson watched from his unmarked car as parents hugged their children tightly, many in tears, all sharing the same unspoken thought. It could have been my child. The innocence of the playground had been shattered, and as Thompson's phone rang with confirmation that Nathan Cooper and his parents were on their way to the police station, he steeled himself for what promised to be a challenging case, a 16-year-old suspect, influential parents, and a murder that had struck at the heart of the community's sense of safety. The interview room at the Billings Police Department was deliberately austere, beige walls, a simple table bolted to the floor, and 4 uncomfortable chairs that had seen decades of use. Detective Richard Thompson stood in the observation room, watching through one-way glass as Nathan Cooper and his parents were escorted in by a uniformed officer. Nathan moved with a casual confidence that immediately caught Thompson's attention. His body language relaxed despite the circumstances, contrasting sharply with his parents' obvious tension. Elizabeth Cooper's knuckles were white as she clutched her designer handbag, while James Cooper's jaw was set in a rigid line, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced assessment of an attorney looking for procedural missteps. "Remember, Nathan is here voluntarily, and as a minor with his parents present," Thompson's partner, Detective Sarah Martinez, reminded him as they observed the family settling into the uncomfortable chairs. Thompson nodded, his eyes never leaving Nathan, noting how the teenager seemed more bored than concerned, examining his fingernails with studied indifference, while his parents whispered urgently to each other. The contrast between Nathan's calm and his parents' anxiety was telling. Either Nathan didn't understand the gravity of the situation, or he was unnaturally composed for a 16-year-old being questioned in connection with a murder. Before entering the interview room, Thompson reviewed the preliminary findings from the crime scene once more. Diego Sanchez had been strangled between 4:30 and 5:15 p.m. The autopsy revealed bruising consistent with large hands. A teenager's hands could have caused such injuries. Fibers found on Diego's clothing were being analyzed, and most significantly, the medical examiner had noted defensive scratches on the killer's hands would be likely, given evidence that Diego had fought back during the attack. Thompson made a mental note to observe Nathan's hands carefully during the interview, looking for any signs of recent scratches or injuries that the teenager might have attempted to conceal. When Thompson finally entered the room, introducing himself and Detective Martinez, he deliberately directed his initial questions to Nathan's parents, establishing their identities and relationship to Nathan, all while covertly observing how Nathan reacted to being temporarily ignored. James Cooper immediately took control of the conversation, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a senior partner at his law firm. Detective Thompson, we understand you're investigating a tragic incident, but I want to be absolutely clear that my son had nothing to do with whatever happened to that child, Cooper stated, not as a father defending his son, but as an attorney presenting an opening argument. Elizabeth Cooper nodded in agreement with her husband, adding in a carefully modulated tone, "Nathan was home with me yesterday afternoon working on a school project in his room." The practiced way she delivered this alibi raised Thompson's suspicions immediately. It was too smooth, too rehearsed for someone who had just learned her son was connected to a murder investigation. Nathan himself remained silent, his eyes moving between the detectives with a calculating gaze that seemed out of place on a teenage face. "Nathan," Thompson said, finally addressing the teenager directly, "could you tell us where you were yesterday between 4 and 6 p.m.? Thompson kept his tone conversational, watching as Nathan straightened slightly in his chair, his eyes briefly flicking toward his mother before he answered. Nathan's voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as he responded, "Like my mom said, I was home working on a history project about World War II. Thompson noticed that Nathan provided no additional details, no mention of specific aspects of the project, no tangential information that typically peppered teenage explanations, just a bare confirmation of his mother's statement. Detective Martinez took notes as Thompson continued his questioning, asking Nathan about his relationship with Miguel Sanchez, carefully observing the teenager's reaction to the name. Nathan's expression remained neutral, but Thompson noticed a slight tightening around his eyes, a micro-expression of recognition or perhaps anger, before Nathan shrugged and responded, "He's just some freshman at school." When pressed about any recent interactions with Miguel, Nathan admitted there had been some stupid thing in the hallway, but insisted it had been no big deal. James Cooper interjected at this point, his tone sharpening as he asked, "Detective, is my son being accused of something based on some schoolyard disagreement?" Thompson maintained his professional demeanor, explaining that they were gathering information about anyone who might have had interactions with the Sanchez family. Elizabeth Cooper placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm, her lawyer's instincts clearly recognizing that antagonizing the detective would not serve their interests. As the interview progressed, Thompson strategically shifted between direct questions about Nathan's whereabouts and more general inquiries about his school life, friends, and activities. Nathan's answers became increasingly minimal, often just one or two words, his initial boredom gradually replaced by a watchful wariness. When Thompson asked to see Nathan's hands, Mentioning casually that they were collecting elimination prints from everyone interviewed, Nathan hesitated for a fraction of a second before extending his hands across the table. Thompson observed Nathan's hands carefully, noting several small scratches across the knuckles and back of both hands, some appearing fresh, others partially healed. "Sports injury?" Thompson asked, keeping his tone light as Nathan quickly withdrew his hands after the detectives had examined them. Nathan nodded, mumbling something about basketball practice, though Thompson recalled that Nathan wasn't listed on any school athletic teams in the information they'd gathered. After 45 minutes, James Cooper ended the interview, stating firmly that they had cooperated fully, and unless Nathan was being charged with something, they were leaving. Thompson didn't object, having gathered valuable observations. Nathan's demeanor throughout the interview had been unnaturally controlled for a teenager. His alibi was suspiciously aligned with his mother's statement. The scratches on his hands were consistent with defensive wounds, and most tellingly, Nathan had shown subtle but definite recognition when Miguel Sanchez was mentioned. As the Coopers were escorted from the interview room, Thompson instructed officers to conduct neighborhood canvassing around the Cooper home, looking for anyone who might have seen Nathan during the critical time period. "And get the school security footage from Central High," Thompson added, wanting to verify Nathan's movements earlier in the day and his interactions with Miguel Sanchez. Detective Martinez nodded, adding, "I'll check if Riverside Elementary has exterior cameras that might have captured the playground area." Thompson returned to the evidence collected at the crime scene, examining photos of footprints found in the soft soil near where Diego's body had been discovered. The prints appeared to be from athletic shoes, size 10 or 11, consistent with a teenage male, and had a distinctive tread pattern that the forensic team was working to identify. If they could match these prints to shoes owned by Nathan Cooper, it would significantly strengthen the case against him. While waiting for forensic results, Thompson drove to Riverside Elementary to re-examine the crime scene in daylight and speak again with Marcus Webb, who was back at work despite the school closure. "There's something else," Marcus said hesitantly when Thompson found him organizing supplies in the janitor's closet. "I didn't mention it before because I wasn't sure if it was important, but I've seen that Cooper kid hanging around the playground a few times in the past couple weeks." Thompson's interest was immediately piqued. If Nathan had been surveilling the area before the murder, it suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Thompson's next stop was Central High School, where he met with the principal and Miguel Sanchez's guidance counselor to learn more about the altercation between Miguel and Nathan. The guidance counselor, Dr. Patrice Williams, had documented the incident, describing how Nathan had been harassing several freshmen, including Miguel. Miguel stood up to him, told him to pick on someone his own size, Dr. Williams explained, and when Nathan tried to intimidate him physically, Miguel used some kind of martial arts move to defend himself. According to the report, Nathan had been humiliated in front of a hallway full of students and had made a threatening comment as he walked away. "You're going to regret this, Sanchez." As Thompson left the high school, his phone rang with news from the forensic team. Fibers found on Diego's clothing matched a distinctive type of wool blend used in high-end sweaters, including the brand Thompson had noticed Nathan wearing during the interview. More significantly, the lab had identified the shoe tread pattern from the crime scene footprints. They matched a limited edition athletic shoe that had been released only 3 months ago, retailing for over $200. Thompson immediately requested a search warrant for the Cooper residence, specifically listing athletic shoes and wool sweaters among the items to be seized. Back at the station, Thompson reviewed security footage from Central High School showing the confrontation between Nathan and Miguel Sanchez. The silent footage clearly showed Nathan's humiliation and the cold, calculating look that came over his face as he made what must have been the threat Dr. Williams had documented. Thompson studied Nathan's expression in the freeze frame, recognizing the same controlled anger he had glimpsed briefly during their interview. "That's not typical teenage impulsiveness," he commented to Detective Martinez as they watched the footage. "That's something else entirely." By evening, Thompson had assembled enough evidence for Judge Harriet Wilson to grant a limited search warrant for the Cooper residence. Thompson knew that James and Elizabeth Cooper would fight the warrant vigorously once executed, so he needed to move quickly and ensure every procedural detail was followed precisely. As darkness fell over Billings for the second time since Diego Sanchez's murder, Thompson gathered his team for a briefing before executing the search warrant, emphasizing the need for professionalism and meticulous documentation. "The Coopers will challenge every piece of evidence we collect," Thompson warned his team. "So everything by the book, understood?" The officers nodded, fully aware that they were dealing with a politically connected family headed by two attorneys who would use every legal maneuver available to protect their son. Thompson checked his watch. It was just past 8 p.m., and gave the order to proceed to the Cooper residence, knowing that what they found in the next few hours could make or break their case against Nathan Cooper. The Cooper residence stood apart from its neighbors in the affluent western section of Billings, its modernist architecture and manicured landscaping projecting success and order even in the darkness. Detective Thompson led the team up the curved driveway, tactical flashlights illuminating the path as officers took position around the perimeter of the property. The doorbell's chime echoed inside the spacious house, followed by the sound of footsteps and James Cooper's voice demanding to know who was there before he opened the door. James Cooper's face hardened as Thompson presented the search warrant, his eyes scanning the document with professional scrutiny, while Elizabeth appeared behind him, her composure slipping for the first time as she saw the assembled officers. "This is harassment," James stated flatly, though he stepped aside as required by law, adding, "My attorney will be here within 20 minutes. Thompson acknowledged this with a professional nod, instructing his team to begin their methodical search while explaining to the Coopers that they could observe but not interfere. Nathan appeared at the top of the curved staircase, his expression unreadable as he watched the officers enter his home, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his designer sweatpants. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice betraying neither fear nor surprise, despite the unusual sight of police officers entering his home with a search warrant. Elizabeth quickly moved to the staircase, instructing Nathan to say nothing and to go back to his room, but Thompson interjected. "Actually, we'll need to search Nathan's room first, and he's welcome to observe." The teenager's bedroom revealed a study in contrasts that immediately caught Thompson's attention. One wall featured academic awards and honor roll certificates neatly framed and aligned with geometric precision, while another wall held artwork with distinctly dark themes, abstract paintings featuring deep reds and blacks, professionally framed sketches of predatory animals. The room was immaculately organized with books alphabetized on shelves, a computer desk free of the typical teenage clutter, and a closet where clothing was arranged by color and type, a level of order that seemed almost obsessive for a 16-year-old boy. Officer Jenkins, a veteran evidence technician, methodically photographed the room before beginning the search, focusing first on the closet where high-end athletic shoes were arranged in a precise line. "Nathan, which shoes did you wear to school yesterday?" Thompson asked conversationally as Jenkins examined each pair. Nathan's response was immediate and specific. Too specific, Thompson thought, as the teenager pointed to a pair of black leather school shoes, adding unprompted, "I only wear those limited edition Nikes on weekends." In the adjacent bathroom, Officer Martinez discovered a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, cotton balls with faint brownish stains, and Band-Aids in the trash can, evidence suggesting someone had recently treated minor wounds. When questioned about these items, Elizabeth Cooper quickly stated that Nathan had scraped his hands helping her move garden supplies the previous weekend, her explanation once again seeming rehearsed to Thompson's experienced ear. Nathan remained silent during this exchange, his eyes tracking the movements of each officer with an intensity that seemed at odds with the bored teenage affect he had projected during his initial interview. The evidence collection continued for over 2 hours, with James Cooper's attorney arriving midway through and raising numerous procedural objections that Thompson calmly addressed while ensuring his team maintained chain of custody for all items collected. The most significant discoveries included a wool sweater with a loose thread matching the fibers found on Diego's clothing, the limited edition athletic shoes with tread patterns consistent with the crime scene footprints, and most damning, a notebook hidden beneath Nathan's mattress containing detailed writings about revenge scenarios, though none specifically mentioning the Sanchez family. As the search concluded and the evidence was transported back to the police department, Thompson requested that Nathan and his parents return to the station the following morning for additional questioning. James Cooper firmly declined, stating that any further questions would need to be submitted through their attorney. Thompson had anticipated this response and didn't push the issue, knowing that the evidence collected would likely be sufficient to obtain an arrest warrant if the forensic analysis confirmed their suspicions. The following morning, November 30th, Thompson sat in his office reviewing the evidence collected and waiting for preliminary results from the forensic team. The notebook discovered in Nathan's room particularly troubled the detective. The writings revealed a methodical, calculating mind obsessed with scenarios of domination and revenge. "This isn't typical teenage angst," Thompson remarked to Detective Martinez as they flipped through photocopies of the notebook pages. "These are elaborate revenge fantasies with detailed planning elements." By mid-morning, the forensic team had confirmed that soil samples embedded in the tread of Nathan's limited edition athletic shoes matched the soil composition at the Riverside Elementary playground. Furthermore, microscopic blood traces had been found on the cuffs of the wool sweater, despite evidence suggesting it had been recently washed. These findings, combined with the eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence, were sufficient for Thompson to request an arrest warrant for Nathan Cooper on charges of first-degree murder. Judge Wilson reviewed the evidence and issued the arrest warrant by early afternoon, with the additional authorization for Nathan to be charged as an adult given the premeditated nature of the crime. Thompson assembled a team to execute the warrant, knowing that arresting the son of 2 prominent attorneys would attract significant media attention and required careful handling. "We do this by the book," Thompson instructed his officers as they prepared to return to the Cooper residence. "No mistakes, no excessive force, everything documented." The Coopers' attorney met the police at the door, having been alerted to their approach by the family's security system. James and Elizabeth Cooper stood in the marble-floored foyer, their professional composure firmly in place, as Thompson explained the arrest warrant. "Where is Nathan?" Thompson asked, after completing the formal explanation of the warrant and the charges. Elizabeth's momentary hesitation told Thompson everything he needed to know before she answered, "He's at school, of course." A quick call to Central High School confirmed what Thompson had suspected. Nathan had not attended school that day. James Cooper's expression remained impassive as he stated, "If Nathan isn't at school, I don't know where he is. Perhaps he's with friends." Thompson immediately dispatched officers to known hangouts of Central High students and to the homes of classmates identified in their investigation, while also issuing a be-on-the-lookout alert to all Billings police units for Nathan Cooper. It was Marcus Webb who provided the crucial tip, calling Thompson directly after spotting Nathan near the Riverside Elementary playground, observing the memorial of stuffed animals and flowers that had been created by community members. "He's just standing there, watching people leave items at the memorial," Marcus reported, his voice tense. "There's something wrong with the way he's looking at it, like he's studying it. Thompson and Martinez arrived at Riverside Elementary within minutes, approaching the playground area cautiously to avoid alerting Nathan to their presence. The teenager stood apart from the small groups of mourners, his hands in the pockets of an expensive leather jacket, his expression one of detached curiosity rather than the somber respect displayed by others at the memorial. When Thompson and Martinez finally moved to approach him, Nathan spotted them immediately, his posture changing subtly from relaxed observation to alert wariness. "Nathan Cooper, we have a warrant for your arrest," Thompson stated clearly, one hand on his holstered weapon as Martinez moved to position herself should Nathan attempt to flee. To their surprise, Nathan made no attempt to run or resist, instead smiling slightly as he extended his wrists for handcuffing. "I was wondering how long it would take you," he said, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction that sent a chill through Thompson's experienced core. The arrest proceeded without incident, with Thompson reciting the Miranda warning as Martinez secured the handcuffs and conducted a brief pat-down search before escorting Nathan to their unmarked police car. Onlookers at the memorial site watched in shocked silence, several recording the arrest on their phones as the detectives placed Nathan in the back seat. Thompson noted that at no point did Nathan ask why he was being arrested or proclaim his innocence, unusual behavior that further convinced the detective they had the right suspect. At the police station, Nathan was processed according to protocol, his fingerprints and mugshot taken, personal belongings inventoried and secured. Throughout the procedure, he maintained an unsettling calm, answering questions with minimal responses and observing the officers with the same detached curiosity he had shown at the memorial site. When placed in an interview room to wait for his parents and their attorney, Nathan sat with perfect posture, his handcuffed hands resting on the table, his expression one of mild interest rather than the fear or anger typically displayed by teenagers in custody. James and Elizabeth Cooper arrived with their attorney, Jonathan Mercer, a prominent criminal defense lawyer known for handling high-profile cases throughout Montana. Mercer immediately demanded a private conference with Nathan, which Thompson granted as required by law, instructing the observation room to be emptied and recording devices turned off during the attorney-client consultation. Through the closed door, Thompson could hear the muffled sounds of urgent conversation, with occasional raised voices suggesting disagreement between Nathan and the adults. When Thompson was finally permitted to enter the interview room with Detective Martinez, the dynamic had visibly shifted. Nathan sat silently while Mercer took control of the interaction, stating firmly that his client would not be answering any questions. "Detective Thompson, my client is a minor who has been subjected to a prejudicial investigation based on flimsy circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a single questionable witness," Mercer declared, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to courtroom victories. Thompson had anticipated this response and didn't press for questioning, instead formally notifying them that Nathan would be held pending arraignment the following morning. Elizabeth Cooper, her professional composure finally cracking, asked if she could hug her son before he was taken to juvenile detention. Thompson allowed this brief contact, noting that while Elizabeth embraced Nathan with the desperate grip of a mother facing her child's potential lifetime incarceration, Nathan's response was a mechanical pat on her back, his eyes remaining fixed on Thompson throughout the embrace. As Nathan was escorted to the juvenile detention center, Thompson returned to his office to prepare the case file for the district attorney, knowing that the Cooper family's connections and resources would ensure a vigorous defense. The evidence was strong, but not irrefutable. They had the eyewitness testimony, the matching fibers and soil samples, the notebook with revenge fantasies, and Nathan's suspicious behavior, but no confession and no direct evidence placing Nathan's hands around Diego Sanchez's neck at the moment of strangulation. Thompson's phone rang as he compiled his notes. It was Dr. Sarah Reynolds, the medical examiner who had performed Diego's autopsy. "Detective, I found something you should know about," Dr. Reynolds said without preamble. "There's a distinctive pattern in the bruising on Diego's neck that suggests the killer has an unusual characteristic, a slightly deformed right index finger, possibly from an old break that didn't heal properly." Thompson immediately recalled observing Nathan's hands during their first interview. The right index finger had indeed appeared slightly bent, a detail Thompson had noted but not connected to the crime until this moment. This new information added a critical piece to their case, potentially providing the physical link between Nathan and the specific manner of Diego's death. Thompson thanked Dr. Reynolds and immediately added this detail to his report for the district attorney, his conviction strengthening that they had indeed arrested the person responsible for Diego Sanchez's murder. As Thompson finished his report, a notification appeared on his computer. Footage from a traffic camera near Riverside Elementary had been located showing Nathan Cooper walking toward the playground at 4:17 p.m. on the day of the murder, directly contradicting his alibi of being home working on a school project. Thompson leaned back in his chair, the pieces falling into place with grim certainty. The evidence now formed a compelling narrative. Nathan Cooper, humiliated by Miguel Sanchez, had carefully planned and executed a revenge killing of Miguel's younger brother, strangling 8-year-old Diego Sanchez at the playground before being spotted by Marcus Webb as he fled the scene. The Eats premeditation evident in Nathan's notebook, combined with the physical evidence and now the traffic camera footage, painted a picture not of impulsive teenage violence, but of calculating, cold-blooded murder. The juvenile detention facility in Billings operated with a clinical efficiency that belied the troubled lives contained within its secure walls. Nathan Cooper had spent his first night in a private cell, a privilege afforded by his status as a high-profile detainee charged with a violent crime. Detective Thompson arrived early on the morning of December 1st to observe Nathan's arraignment, curious to see how the teenager would present himself in court and how his high-powered legal team would approach his defense. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, community members, and the Sanchez family who sat together in the front row, their faces bearing the unmistakable hollowness of profound grief. Judge Eleanor Hartman, known for her strict courtroom management and fair handling of juvenile cases, entered promptly at 9 a.m., her expression grave as she surveyed the crowded room. Nathan was brought in wearing a carefully selected outfit, khaki slacks, and a blue button-down shirt that emphasized his youth and student status. A strategic choice by his defense team that Thompson immediately recognized as an attempt to counteract the severity of the charges. Jonathan Mercer entered a not guilty plea on Nathan's behalf, immediately following with a motion for Nathan's release into his parents' custody pending trial. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Chen countered forcefully, citing the severity of the charges, the strength of the evidence, and most significantly, Nathan's apparent attempt to intimidate a key witness, information Thompson had provided based on a subsequent interview with Marcus Webb. Judge Hartman denied the motion for release, ordering Nathan to remain in juvenile detention given the seriousness of the charges and the potential flight risk, a decision that caused Elizabeth Cooper to visibly flinch while James Cooper's expression hardened into barely controlled anger. Following the arraignment, Thompson returned to the station to meet with Marcus Webb, who had contacted him with additional information he felt uncomfortable sharing in his initial statements. "The Cooper kid approached me 2 days after the murder," Marcus explained, his hands fidgeting nervously on the table between them. "He came up to me in the parking lot after my shift, real casual-like, and whispered, 'I know where you sleep,' while slipping me $50. Thompson leaned forward, his interest immediately piqued by this new information that suggested Nathan had attempted to silence a potential witness, Marcus described how Nathan had seemed completely at ease during the interaction, maintaining direct eye contact while speaking in a conversational tone that belied the threatening nature of his words. He wasn't acting scared or desperate, or, Marcus emphasized, pushing the crumpled $50 bill across the table toward Thompson. He was confident, like he was handling a business transaction. Thompson carefully placed the money into an evidence bag, recognizing its significance both as proof of witness tampering and as a potential source of physical evidence through fingerprint or DNA analysis. Thompson's next step was to re-interview several of Nathan's classmates, focusing on his behavior in the days following the murder. Emma Lawson, a junior who shared several advanced placement classes with Nathan, described how he had seemed completely normal during classes the day after Diego's body was discovered. "We were all talking about it, this little kid being killed right near our school, and Nathan was just sitting there doing his calculus homework like nothing had happened," Emma recalled, her expression troubled as she spoke. Another classmate, Tyler Rodriguez, provided even more disturbing information, describing how he had overheard Nathan in the restroom the day after the murder, practicing different facial expressions in the mirror. He was like trying out different looks, sad, shocked, confused, and then he'd shake his head and try another one, Tyler explained, demonstrating the methodical way Nathan had been rehearsing emotional responses. "It was weird, man, like he was preparing for a role in a play or something." Armed with these new insights, Thompson decided it was time to speak with Nathan's parents without their attorney present, hoping that the mounting evidence might crack their unified front. He found James and Elizabeth Cooper at their law offices, where they reluctantly agreed to meet with him in a conference room, though both immediately stated that they would not discuss their son without legal representation. Thompson acknowledged this limitation, but proceeded to share what he had learned about Nathan's attempt to silence Marcus Webb and his apparent emotional rehearsal the day after the murder. Elizabeth Cooper's composure fractured slightly at this information, her legal training temporarily overridden by maternal concern, as she asked, "What are you suggesting, Detective?" Thompson responded carefully, explaining that Nathan's behavior exhibited patterns consistent with antisocial personality traits rather than typical teenage rebellion or poor judgment. "Has Nathan ever shown concerning behaviors at home?" Thompson asked, watching as the Coopers exchanged a quick, loaded glance that confirmed his suspicions before James Cooper abruptly ended the meeting. That exchange, brief as it was, convinced Thompson that the Coopers had observed troubling behavior in their son, but had used their knowledge of the legal system and their community connections to conceal or minimize these incidents. A subsequent conversation with Nathan's former middle school principal revealed that 3 years earlier, several small animals had been found mutilated on school grounds, and while Nathan had never been formally accused, his name had come up in the investigation before being quickly dropped after James Cooper threatened legal action against the school for defamation. Thompson's investigation took another significant turn when forensic analysis of Nathan's cell phone, seized during his arrest, revealed that he had conducted multiple internet searches about strangulation, asphyxiation, and how long it takes for someone to die from oxygen deprivation. Most damning were searches specific to children's anatomy and the amount of force required to crush a child's trachea, conducted in the weeks leading up to Diego's murder, clear evidence of premeditation that strengthened the prosecution's case for trying Nathan as an adult, despite his age. Assistant District Attorney Chen called Thompson to discuss the mounting evidence, particularly concerned about reports that James and Elizabeth Cooper were leveraging their professional connections to control the narrative around their son's case. "They've already had lunch with Judge Wilson's husband and been seen golfing with Commissioner Blackwell," Chen informed Thompson, her frustration evident. "They're working every angle to influence potential jurors and pressure my office to reduce the charges." Thompson wasn't surprised by these tactics, but assured Chen that the evidence they were accumulating would speak for itself, regardless of the Coopers' attempts to manipulate the system. Detective Martinez had been tasked with creating a timeline of Nathan's movements on the day of the murder, painstakingly piecing together security footage from multiple sources to track his path from Central High School to Riverside Elementary. "We've got him leaving Central at 3:45, walking toward Riverside, then the traffic camera shows him near the playground at 4:17, Martinez reported, laying out still images from the footage. Then Webb sees him leaving the area around 5 hours, and we have another camera catching him 6 blocks away at 5:22, heading in the direction of his home. This timeline directly contradicted Nathan's alibi and provided crucial support for the prosecution's case. Thompson decided it was time for another attempt at interviewing Nathan, hoping that the teenager's night in detention and the mounting evidence might make him more willing to talk. After consulting with Assistant District Attorney Chen, Thompson approached Jonathan Mercer with a proposal. If Nathan would agree to a recorded interview, the prosecution would consider taking the death penalty off the table if the case proceeded to adult court. Mercer initially dismissed the offer, confident in his ability to have the case kept in juvenile court, where Nathan would face a maximum sentence of detention until age 21, but agreed to present the option to his client. To Thompson's surprise, Nathan agreed to the interview, overriding his parents' objections, according to Mercer. He says he wants to clear things up, Mercer explained with visible skepticism as he arranged the details of the interview. Thompson knew better than to expect a confession, but hoped that a longer conversation might reveal inconsistencies in Nathan's story or provide insights into his psychological state that could be useful in building their case. The interview room at the Juvenile Detention Center was smaller than the one at the police station, with softer furnishings intended to appear less intimidating to young offenders. Nathan entered with the same composed demeanor he had maintained throughout his interactions with law enforcement, taking a seat across from Thompson and Martinez while Mercer sat beside him, legal pad at the ready to interrupt any problematic lines of questioning. Thompson began by establishing rapport, asking Nathan how he was adjusting to detention, noting how the teenager responded with carefully constructed answers that revealed nothing of his true feelings. As Thompson gradually shifted toward questions about Nathan's movements on the day of Diego's murder, he observed subtle changes in Nathan's body language. A slight tightening around the eyes when the playground was mentioned, a barely perceptible pause before responding to questions about his alibi. "We have footage of you walking toward Riverside Elementary at 4:17 p.m., Thompson stated, placing a still image from the traffic camera on the table between them. "Can you explain why you were in that area when you told us you were home working on a school project?" Nathan's response was immediate and rehearsed, suggesting he had anticipated this evidence. "I went for a walk to clear my head after school," he explained, his voice steady. "I often walk through that neighborhood on my way home." When Thompson pressed about the timing discrepancy, pointing out that Nathan would have had to leave immediately after school rather than staying for study hall, as he had previously claimed, Nathan shrugged slightly and responded, "I decided to skip study hall that day. It's not mandatory." Thompson noted how Nathan consistently provided plausible explanations for each piece of evidence presented, always with the same calm demeanor and direct eye contact that most people would associate with truthfulness, but that Thompson recognized as the carefully constructed facade of someone accustomed to deception. When Thompson mentioned Marcus Webb's allegation about the bribe and threat, Nathan's expression registered brief surprise, not at the accusation itself, Thompson noted, but apparently at Webb's willingness to come forward despite the intimidation attempt. "Marcus misunderstood our interaction," Nathan stated after a quick glance at his attorney. "I was thanking him for always being nice to me at school, and I gave him money as a holiday tip, the way people do with service workers." The explanation was smooth, reasonable, and completely at odds with Webb's account of being threatened with the words, "I know where you sleep." Thompson made note of Nathan's ability to reframe events to cast himself in a positive light, a manipulation tactic that revealed sophisticated cognitive processing unusual for his age. As the interview progressed to its second hour, Thompson shifted tactics, moving away from direct questions about the murder to more general inquiries about Nathan's relationship with Miguel Sanchez and his feelings about the altercation at school. "Miguel embarrassed you in front of your peers," Thompson stated, matter-of-factly. "That must have made you angry." Nathan's response was measured, acknowledging that he had been annoyed by the incident, but insisting it hadn't been significant enough to dwell on. Thompson then produced photocopies of pages from Nathan's notebook, showing detailed revenge scenarios that, while not naming specific targets, described situations with striking similarities to the altercation with Miguel. "These writings suggest you think a lot about getting back at people who wrong you," Thompson observed, watching Nathan's reaction carefully. For the first time, Nathan showed genuine emotion, a flash of anger quickly suppressed, before Mercer interjected, objecting to the line of questioning and demanding to know how these materials were relevant to Diego Sanchez's murder. Thompson explained the prosecution's theory that Nathan, humiliated by Miguel Sanchez, had targeted Miguel's younger brother as the ultimate form of revenge, knowing that killing Diego would cause Miguel far more suffering than any direct action against him personally. Nathan's expression remained neutral throughout this explanation, but Thompson noticed his breathing had quickened slightly, the only visible sign that the detective's words had affected him. As the interview concluded without Nathan making any incriminating statements, Thompson was nevertheless satisfied with what he had observed: Nathan's controlled responses, his sophisticated ability to reframe events, his momentary emotional reaction to the notebook evidence, and most tellingly, his complete lack of expressed empathy for Diego Sanchez or the grieving Sanchez family. These observations, combined with the physical evidence and witness testimony, strengthened Thompson's conviction that Nathan Cooper was not just guilty of Diego's murder, but represented a genuine danger to society, a teenager with antisocial traits who had already escalated to homicide. Outside the interview room, Mercer approached Thompson with an unexpected comment. "You know, Detective, in 15 years of criminal defense, I've represented hundreds of juveniles charged with serious crimes," the attorney said quietly. "Most of them are scared kids who made terrible choices in the heat of the moment." Mercer glanced back toward the room where Nathan was being escorted back to his cell. "This is different," Thompson nodded, recognizing the rare moment of candor from an adversarial attorney who had clearly observed the same concerning patterns in Nathan's behavior. The interrogation room at the Billings Police Department had seen countless confessions over the years, its walls absorbing the stories of crimes ranging from petty theft to the darkest acts of human violence. Detective Richard Thompson had requested that Nathan Cooper be transferred from juvenile detention to the police department for a follow-up interview, a strategic decision based on his belief that the more formal, adult setting might affect Nathan's carefully maintained composure. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Chen had secured the necessary permissions, overriding objections from Jonathan Mercer, who nevertheless accompanied his client, determined to prevent any procedural missteps that might compromise their defense. Nathan entered the room with the same measured confidence he had displayed in previous interactions, though Thompson noticed subtle differences in his demeanor, a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible tension in his shoulders, suggesting that his night in detention had affected him more than he wanted to reveal. Thompson had deliberately arranged the room differently for this interview, removing the clock from the wall, adjusting the temperature to be slightly cooler than comfortable, and positioning Nathan's chair directly under the harshest of the fluorescent lights, environmental manipulations designed to gradually increase psychological discomfort during a prolonged interrogation. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us again, Nathan," Thompson began, his tone deliberately casual as Detective Martinez set up the recording equipment. Nathan nodded slightly, his eyes tracking Martinez's movements with the analytical focus that Thompson had come to recognize as characteristic of the teenager's observational style. Mercer immediately established ground rules, stating that he would terminate the interview at the first sign of coercive tactics, or if Nathan became fatigued, a standard protection for juvenile clients that Thompson acknowledged with professional courtesy while privately planning a questioning strategy that would work within these constraints. Thompson began with seemingly innocuous questions about Nathan's academic interests and future plans, establishing rapport while observing how the teenager constructed his responses, each answer precise, neither too short nor too detailed, consistently portraying himself as a dedicated student with aspirations to study psychology or law at an Ivy League university. "You seem very interested in how people think," Thompson commented, transitioning gradually toward more relevant areas. "What fascinates you most about human behavior?" Nathan's response revealed the first glimpse of genuine engagement, his clinical description of interest in why people make the choices they do, especially under pressure, delivered with an intensity that caught Thompson's attention. "Some people act on pure emotion," Nathan continued, leaning forward slightly, "but others can think through their actions, consider consequences, make calculated decisions, even when emotions are involved." The teenager's analysis could have been an academic observation, but Thompson recognized it as something more personal, a window into Nathan's own cognitive processes, and his pride in his perceived ability to operate above emotional impulses. Seizing this opening, Thompson shifted the conversation toward the concept of revenge, presenting it as a theoretical psychological topic rather than a direct accusation. "Revenge is an interesting psychological motivation," Thompson remarked, keeping his tone conversational. "Some experts believe it's one of the most calculated forms of violence because it requires planning rather than just emotional reaction." Nathan nodded with evident interest, adding that effective revenge requires understanding what would truly hurt someone, not just physically, but emotionally or psychologically. Thompson noted how Nathan's engagement increased when discussing theoretical aspects of criminal psychology, his vocabulary becoming more sophisticated and his analysis more nuanced, revealing an intelligence that made his actions all the more disturbing. When Thompson carefully guided the conversation toward Nathan's own experiences with conflict at school, the teenager's demeanor shifted subtly, his responses becoming more measured, more rehearsed, as if recognizing the conversation was moving into dangerous territory. "Let's talk about Miguel Sanchez," Thompson said directly, watching Nathan's reaction closely. "You mentioned in our previous conversation that there was a stupid thing in the hallway between you two." Nathan's expression remained neutral, but Thompson noticed his right hand resting on the table flex slightly, a micro-expression of tension that contradicted his verbal response. "It wasn't important," Nathan stated with practiced dismissal, "just a typical high school disagreement that got exaggerated." Thompson then produced the school security footage showing the altercation, placing a tablet on the table between them with the video cued to the moment Miguel used a defensive martial arts move to counter Nathan's intimidation attempt, sending Nathan stumbling backward in front of laughing classmates. "This seems more significant than you described," Thompson observed, watching as Nathan viewed the footage with an unnerving stillness, his eyes focused on the screen with predatory intensity. "Teenagers get into disagreements all the time, Detective," Mercer interjected, reaching to turn off the tablet. "This has no bearing on the tragic death of Diego Sanchez." Thompson maintained his focus on Nathan, whose breathing had subtly changed, becoming more controlled and deliberate as he visibly worked to maintain his composed exterior. "I'd like to hear Nathan's thoughts on how this incident made him feel," Thompson pressed, intentionally using language that invited emotional disclosure. Nathan's response was revealing in its calculated nature. "Obviously, I was embarrassed," he acknowledged with a dismissive shrug that seemed practiced rather than natural. "But I moved on." Thompson noted the discrepancy between this claim and the detailed revenge scenarios in Nathan's notebook, but chose not to confront this contradiction directly, instead shifting to a different approach by asking, "Did you know Miguel had a younger brother who attended Riverside Elementary?" The question was designed to appear as a simple fact-checking inquiry, while actually testing Nathan's knowledge of Diego Sanchez prior to the murder. Nathan hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "I might have heard that mentioned at school, but I didn't know him personally." Thompson nodded as if accepting this answer, while making a mental note of the hesitation and the careful wording that neither confirmed nor denied specific knowledge of Diego. "Let's talk about the day Diego was killed," Thompson continued, intentionally using the victim's name repeatedly to observe Nathan's reactions. "You told us you went for a walk that afternoon to clear your head." Nathan nodded, maintaining the alibi he had established in their previous interview. Thompson then laid out a series of photos, showing the route Nathan would have taken from Central High School to Riverside Elementary, based on the security camera footage they had collected. "This is quite a detour from your normal route home," Thompson observed, "almost 2 miles out of your way, in fact." Nathan's explanation was immediate and rehearsed, suggesting he had anticipated this line of questioning. "I like to vary my routes," he stated with practiced casualness. "Walking helps me think, and I don't always take the most direct path home." Thompson nodded as if accepting this explanation, then asked why Nathan had specifically chosen to walk past an elementary school playground at precisely the time children would be present after their early dismissal for the holiday. "I wasn't aware of their schedule," Nathan replied, though Thompson noticed his right index finger, the same one Dr. Reynolds had identified as having a distinctive deformity, matching the bruising pattern on Diego's neck, tapping lightly on the table, a subtle tell that contradicted his verbal denial. Thompson then produced a printout of Nathan's internet search history from his phone, showing multiple visits to the Riverside Elementary website, where the Thanksgiving week schedule had been prominently displayed. "You visited this page 6 times in the week before Diego's murder," Thompson stated, watching as Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly at this evidence. Mercer immediately objected, arguing that visiting a school website wasn't indicative of criminal intent, but Thompson had already achieved his purpose, observing Nathan's momentary break in composure when confronted with evidence of premeditation. "Nathan, the evidence suggests you knew exactly when Diego would be at that playground," Thompson continued, his tone remaining conversational rather than accusatory. "We have the searches on your phone, the security footage tracking your movements, the eyewitness who saw you leaving the scene, and the fibers from your clothing found on Diego's body." For the first time in their interactions, Thompson observed genuine concern flash across Nathan's face, not guilt or remorse, but the calculating realization that the evidence against him was more substantial than he had been led to believe. This moment of vulnerability was quickly masked as Nathan glanced at Mercer, who immediately announced they would be taking a break to confer privately. Thompson granted this request, using the interruption to confer with Detective Martinez about Nathan's reactions and to plan the next phase of questioning. When the interview resumed 15 minutes later, Nathan's composure had been restored, though Thompson noticed increased vigilance in his responses, a heightened awareness that he was being carefully observed and analyzed. Thompson shifted tactics, moving away from the direct evidence to focus on Nathan's psychological state, an approach that had previously elicited more genuine engagement from the teenager. "I've been reviewing your notebook, Nathan," Thompson said, placing several photocopied pages on the table. "You have a very unique way of looking at the world." Nathan's eyes moved to the pages, which contained his detailed writings about dominance hierarchies, power dynamics, and theoretical scenarios about the perfect revenge, none specifically mentioning the Sanchez family, but many describing situations with striking parallels to his conflict with Miguel. "These are just creative writing exercises," Nathan stated, though his tone lacked the dismissive quality he had maintained when discussing the security footage. "My English teacher encourages us to explore different perspectives and psychological states in our writing." Thompson nodded thoughtfully, responding, "You have a sophisticated understanding of psychology for someone your age, particularly your insights about how to cause maximum psychological damage to someone." Nathan visibly reacted to what he perceived as a compliment, his posture straightening slightly as Thompson continued. "For instance, this passage where you write about the perfect revenge being an action that forces someone to live with permanent consequences they can never escape. That shows remarkable insight into psychological torture." This approach, appealing to Nathan's evident pride in his intelligence, produced the most authentic engagement Thompson had witnessed from the teenager. Nathan began elaborating on his theoretical framework for understanding power dynamics and revenge psychology, his vocabulary becoming more sophisticated and his analysis more detailed as he explained his belief that true power comes from knowing what matters most to someone and being able to take that away permanently. Thompson listened with professional interest, recognizing that Nathan was inadvertently revealing his motive and thought process, while believing he was simply demonstrating his intellectual sophistication. When Nathan described revenge as most satisfying when it creates a permanent void in someone's life that can never be filled, Thompson saw the perfect opening to ask, "Is that what you wanted to achieve with Miguel Sanchez? To create a permanent void in his life by taking his brother?" The question landed with precision, causing Nathan to freeze momentarily, his rehearsed responses inadequate for this direct connection between his theoretical writings and the specific details of Diego's murder. Mercer immediately objected, stating that the question assumed facts, not an evidence, and attempted to put words in his client's mouth. Thompson acknowledged the objection, but had already observed what he needed. Nathan's momentary unguarded reaction, revealing the accuracy of the detective's assessment. As the interview entered its third hour, Thompson noticed signs of fatigue beginning to affect Nathan, despite his determined efforts to maintain his composed facade. His responses came slightly slower, his posture less perfect, his eyes occasionally losing focus before he forced himself back to alertness. Thompson strategically introduced evidence in a nonlinear fashion during this period, jumping between topics to prevent Nathan from settling into rehearsed responses. The fibers on Diego's clothing, the searches on his phone, Marcus Webb's testimony about the bribe and threat, the footprints at the scene. "You told Marcus Webb I know where you sleep while giving him $50, Thompson stated, placing the evidence bag containing the crumpled bill on the table. "That sounds like witness intimidation, Nathan." Nathan shook his head, maintaining his previous explanation that he had merely been giving Webb a holiday tip, though his response lacked the confident delivery of earlier denials. Thompson pressed further, asking why Nathan would give a $50 tip to a school janitor he barely knew, particularly just days after that janitor had witnessed him leaving the scene of a murder. Mercer intervened again, reminding Thompson that his client had provided an explanation for this interaction and that continued questioning on this point was becoming harassment. Thompson nodded respectfully but continued to observe Nathan, noting the teenager's increasing frustration at being unable to control the narrative as he had in previous interactions. This frustration manifested in subtle ways, a tightness around his mouth, a slight flush rising from his neck, his right hand curling into a loose fist on the table before deliberately relaxing again. In the final phase of the interview, Thompson took his most significant risk, deliberately appealing to what he'd identified as Nathan's core psychological drive, his need to be recognized as intellectually superior and in control. "You know, Nathan," Thompson said conversationally, "most teenage killers act impulsively. They lash out in anger or fear, make countless mistakes, leave obvious evidence." Thompson paused, watching as Nathan's attention focused completely on his words. But this murder was different, calculated, planned, executed with unusual precision for someone so young. Nathan's expression remained neutral, but Thompson noticed his pupils dilate slightly at what the teenager perceived as an acknowledgement of his exceptional nature, exactly as Thompson had anticipated based on the psychological profile he had been constructing throughout their interactions. Whoever killed Diego understood exactly how to cause the maximum psychological damage to Miguel, Thompson continued, intentionally framing the statement as a hypothetical while observing Nathan's reaction. Not just physical harm to Miguel himself, but the permanent psychological torture of taking his little brother, someone Miguel was supposed to protect. The interview concluded shortly thereafter, with Mercer finally insisting that his client was fatigued and needed to return to juvenile detention. Thompson had not secured a confession, but he had achieved something potentially more valuable for building their case: insights into Nathan Cooper's psychological makeup that explained both the motive and the methodical nature of Diego's murder. As Nathan was escorted from the room, Thompson noticed something he hadn't observed in their previous interactions: a slight smile playing at the corner of the teenager's mouth, a subtle but unmistakable expression of satisfaction. He enjoyed the intellectual challenge, Thompson remarked to Detective Martinez as they reviewed their notes after Nathan's departure. He sees this as a game, a chance to demonstrate his superiority by matching wits with law enforcement. Martinez nodded in agreement, adding that Nathan had appeared most engaged when Thompson had indirectly acknowledged the sophisticated planning behind the crime, responding to the perceived recognition of his intelligence rather than showing any concern for the seriousness of the charges against him. Thompson's report to Assistant District Attorney Chen later that day emphasized these psychological observations alongside the physical evidence they had accumulated. Nathan Cooper doesn't fit the typical profile of a juvenile offender acting on impulse or peer pressure, Thompson explained, as they prepared for the upcoming hearing to determine whether Nathan would be tried as an adult. He demonstrates sophisticated planning, absence of empathy, and calculated decision-making more consistent with adult criminals. Chen nodded gravely, understanding the implications of Thompson's assessment not just for their current case, but for the broader question of Nathan Cooper's danger to society, regardless of his age. The Billings Police Department evidence room was meticulously organized, its shelves lined with labeled boxes containing the physical remnants of human tragedy, each item cataloged and preserved according to strict protocol to maintain chain of custody. Detective Thompson stood among these shelves on a cold December morning, examining the box labeled Sanchez Diego Homicide that contained the tangible elements of the case against Nathan Cooper: the wool fibers matching Nathan's sweater, soil samples from his shoes, the $50 bill given to Marcus Webb, photocopies of the notebook found under Nathan's mattress, and most recently a flash drive containing the complete forensic analysis of Nathan's cell phone and computer. Thompson had been particularly interested in the digital evidence, knowing from experience that even the most careful criminals often revealed their true thoughts and intentions in private online activities. The forensic tech team had recovered not only the searches related to strangulation and children's anatomy that they had already discovered, but also a deleted folder containing surveillance photos of Riverside Elementary School, taken over several weeks prior to Diego's murder. These photos, apparently taken by Nathan himself from various vantage points, showed different angles of the playground, the surrounding streets, and, most disturbingly, several images capturing Diego Sanchez walking home from school, evidence of calculated stalking that strengthened their case for premeditation. "He was hunting," Thompson remarked to Detective Martinez as they reviewed the recovered images. "These aren't random shots. He was mapping the area, learning Diego's routine, identifying the optimal location and time." Martinez nodded in agreement, pointing to time-stamped data showing that the surveillance had begun just 2 days after Nathan's altercation with Miguel Sanchez. A clear connection between the humiliation Nathan had suffered and the calculated revenge he had begun planning almost immediately afterward. The forensic analysis had also recovered deleted text messages between Nathan and a fellow student named Ethan Walsh, containing cryptic references to what Nathan called the perfect solution to the Miguel problem. While never explicitly mentioning violence against Diego, the messages showed Nathan's preoccupation with finding a way to make Miguel suffer permanently, and included a disturbing comment 3 days before the murder. By this time next week, Miguel Sanchez will understand what real pain feels like. Armed with this new evidence, Thompson requested another interview with Nathan, but Jonathan Mercer refused, stating that his client would not be speaking further with investigators before the hearing to determine whether he would be tried as an adult or remain in juvenile court. This hearing, scheduled for December 10th, had become the immediate focus of both the prosecution and defense, with the outcome potentially determining whether Nathan faced a few years in juvenile detention or the possibility of life imprisonment in the adult system. Thompson used the intervening days to continue building their case, interviewing teachers and classmates about Nathan's behavior in the weeks leading up to Diego's murder. Ms. Eleanor Winters, Nathan's English teacher, provided particularly valuable insights, sharing that Nathan's writing had taken a darker turn in recent months, focusing increasingly on themes of revenge and psychological torture. "I was concerned enough to schedule a meeting with his parents," Ms. Winters explained, "but they canceled twice. And then James Cooper called the principal to complain that I was targeting their son with unnecessary scrutiny." This pattern of parental interference emerged repeatedly as Thompson spoke with school administrators who described multiple incidents where James and Elizabeth Cooper had used their status as prominent attorneys to shield Nathan from consequences for concerning behavior. Principal David Morales recounted an incident from the previous year when another student had accused Nathan of threatening him, only to have the complaint withdrawn after Elizabeth Cooper reminded the student's parents that their ongoing custody dispute would be complicated by involvement in a school disciplinary case. Thompson also met with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic psychologist who had been appointed by the court to evaluate Nathan's psychological state and provide an opinion on whether he should be tried as an adult. While Dr. Mitchell couldn't share the specifics of her evaluation before submitting her report to the court, she spoke with Thompson in general terms about adolescents who commit violent crimes. There's a fundamental difference between impulsive violence stemming from poor emotional regulation, which is common in teenagers, and calculated violence that shows planning, forethought, and an absence of empathy, Dr. Mitchell explained. The latter is much more concerning from both a legal and psychological perspective. On December 7th, Thompson received the final autopsy report from Dr. Reynolds, confirming her earlier observation about the distinctive bruising pattern on Diego's neck, matching the unusual bend in Nathan's right index finger. The report also contained another significant finding. Microscopic skin cells had been found under Diego's fingernails, preserved despite Nathan's apparent attempt to clean himself after the murder. The DNA analysis was still pending, but if it matched Nathan, it would provide direct physical evidence linking him to the struggle with Diego in his final moments. Assistant District Attorney Chen used these developments to file a supplemental motion arguing strongly for Nathan to be tried as an adult, citing the extensive evidence of premeditation, the extreme psychological calculation involved in targeting a victim specifically to cause maximum suffering to another person, and the sophisticated efforts to avoid detection afterward. This is not impulsive teenage behavior, Chen wrote in the motion. This is the calculated act of someone who fully understood the nature and consequences of his actions and took deliberate steps to plan and execute a revenge killing. The Cooper family had not remained idle during this period, with James and Elizabeth leveraging every professional connection and resource at their disposal to influence the upcoming hearing. Thompson learned from courthouse sources that James Cooper had been seen dining with Judge Wilson's husband, while Elizabeth had organized a fundraiser for the district attorney's re-election campaign, transparent attempts to create conflicts of interest that might benefit their son's case. More concerning to Thompson was the media narrative being carefully cultivated through strategic leaks to friendly journalists, portraying Nathan as an exceptional student being railroaded by an overzealous prosecution based on circumstantial evidence. On December 9th, the day before the critical hearing, Thompson received the DNA results he had been waiting for. The skin cells found under Diego's fingernails were a match for Nathan Cooper, providing the direct physical evidence that completed their case. Thompson immediately forwarded the results to Chen, who filed an emergency motion to include this evidence in the next day's hearing, despite the defense's likely objection to its last-minute introduction. The morning of the hearing brought a light snowfall to Billings, the courthouse steps slippery with ice as Thompson made his way inside, nodding to the Sanchez family who stood huddled together near the entrance, their faces drawn with grief and the strain of ongoing media attention. Inside the courtroom, James and Elizabeth Cooper sat directly behind the defense table, both dressed impeccably in conservative attire that projected professional authority rather than parental anguish, a calculated image choice that Thompson noted as consistent with their overall approach to their son's case. Judge Eleanor Hartman entered the courtroom precisely at 9 a.m., her expression severe, as she called the hearing to order and immediately addressed the prosecution's emergency motion to introduce the new DNA evidence. Jonathan Mercer objected vigorously, arguing that the last-minute submission violated discovery rules and prevented the defense from properly evaluating the evidence. Judge Hartman, known for her strict adherence to procedural fairness, nevertheless ruled that the DNA evidence could be considered for the limited purpose of the transfer hearing, noting that the defense would have ample time to examine it before trial, regardless of whether that trial occurred in juvenile or adult court. The hearing proceeded with Assistant District Attorney Chen presenting the prosecution's case for trying Nathan as an adult, methodically outlining the evidence of premeditation, the calculated nature of the crime, and Nathan's sophisticated efforts to cover his tracks afterward. Chen emphasized the recovered surveillance photos showing Nathan had stalked Diego for weeks, the internet searches about strangulation techniques specific to children, the journal entries revealing revenge fantasies, and finally, the DNA evidence confirming direct physical contact between Nathan and Diego during the murder. Your Honor, Chen concluded, her voice carrying throughout the now silent courtroom, the evidence before you demonstrates that Nathan Cooper committed this murder with a level of planning and psychological calculation that belies his chronological age. He selected Diego Sanchez not randomly, but specifically because killing this child would cause maximum psychological suffering to Miguel Sanchez, who had humiliated Nathan at school. Chen paused, allowing the horror of this calculated cruelty to sink in before adding, "This is not impulsive teenage behavior. This is the act of someone who fully understood what he was doing and made deliberate choices at every step." Jonathan Mercer countered with a passionate defense focusing on Nathan's age, arguing that regardless of the nature of the crime, a 16-year-old's brain was not fully developed, and therefore Nathan could not be held to the same standard of culpability as an adult. Mercer emphasized Nathan's previously clean criminal record, his academic achievements, and the potential for rehabilitation within the juvenile system, dismissing the evidence of premeditation as teenage fantasy writing rather than genuine planning. Throughout the proceedings, Thompson observed Nathan's demeanor, noting that the teenager maintained the same composed, almost detached expression he had shown in their interviews, occasionally whispering to Mercer but showing no visible reaction to the graphic descriptions of Diego's murder or the evidence linking him to the crime. Only when Dr. Sarah Mitchell took the stand to deliver her psychological assessment did Thompson notice a change in Nathan's demeanor, a subtle tensing of his posture and narrowing of his eyes as he focused intently on the psychologist's testimony. Dr. Mitchell's assessment was unequivocal. Based on her evaluation, Nathan Cooper demonstrated a concerning absence of empathy, sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation, and an ability to plan and execute complex actions with full awareness of their consequences. Most significantly, Dr. Mitchell testified that Nathan had exhibited pride when discussing his intellectual capabilities during their sessions, particularly his ability to understand what truly hurts people at a deeper level than just physical pain. In my professional opinion, Dr. Mitchell concluded, Nathan Cooper has the psychological development and understanding of an adult in terms of comprehending the nature and consequences of his actions. His chronological age is 16, but his cognitive processing of moral decisions and understanding of psychological cause and effect is fully developed. This testimony directly addressed the central question before the court, whether Nathan, despite his age, possessed the mental capacity to be tried as an adult for the murder of Diego Sanchez. Following Dr. Mitchell's testimony, Judge Hartman called for a brief recess, during which Thompson observed a tense conversation between Nathan and his parents in the hallway outside the courtroom. For the first time, Thompson noticed genuine emotion from Elizabeth Cooper, who appeared to be pleading with Nathan about something while he responded with the same detached manner he had shown throughout the proceedings. James Cooper stood slightly apart from this interaction, his expression grim as he spoke quietly with Jonathan Mercer, both men occasionally glancing toward Nathan with what Thompson interpreted as growing concern rather than the confident defiance they had displayed earlier. When court resumed, Judge Hartman delivered her ruling without preamble. Based on the evidence presented, including the extensive proof of premeditation, the calculated nature of the crime, the psychological evaluation, and the DNA evidence confirming Nathan's direct involvement, the court found that the interests of justice required Nathan Cooper to be tried as an adult for the first-degree murder of Diego Sanchez. The Sanchez family clasped hands tightly at this announcement, while Elizabeth Cooper visibly flinched as if struck, the legal reality of her son's situation finally breaking through her professional composure. Following the hearing, Thompson returned to the station to update his case files and prepare for the next phase of the prosecution. The decision to try Nathan as an adult significantly changed the potential consequences he faced, from a maximum of 5 years in juvenile detention to the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. Thompson knew that the Coopers would likely appeal the ruling, but Judge Hartman's careful adherence to procedural requirements and the overwhelming evidence supporting her decision made such an appeal unlikely to succeed. Later that evening, Thompson received an unexpected call from Jonathan Mercer requesting a meeting without Nathan or his parents present, an unusual request that immediately piqued the detective's interest. They met at a coffee shop several blocks from the courthouse where Mercer, looking uncharacteristically troubled, ordered a black coffee and sat across from Thompson with the demeanor of a man wrestling with a difficult decision. "I've been practicing law for 20 years," Mercer began after several moments of silence. "I've defended people accused of terrible things, and I've always believed in the system's ability to provide fair representation for everyone, regardless of what they might have done." Thompson nodded, waiting patiently as Mercer gathered his thoughts. Recognizing the attorney was struggling with something that went beyond the usual adversarial relationship between defense counsel and law enforcement. "James and Elizabeth Cooper just fired me," Mercer finally stated, his expression troubled. "They want to bring in a high-profile defense team from Chicago, specialists in juvenile cases who've made a career of keeping teenagers out of adult court regardless of the crimes they've committed." Thompson maintained his professional neutrality, knowing that Mercer couldn't and wouldn't share privileged information about his former client, but understanding that the attorney had sought this meeting for a reason beyond simply informing him of a change in Nathan's legal representation. After another long pause, Mercer spoke again, choosing his words with evident care. "Detective, I can't discuss specifics about Nathan or my interactions with him, but I want you to know that in all my years of practice, I've never been more concerned about what might happen if someone returns to society without addressing underlying issues." The implication was clear. Even without violating attorney-client privilege, Mercer, who had spent significant time with Nathan Cooper and observed him in ways Thompson could not, believed the teenager posed a genuine danger to society. This assessment from a defense attorney who had built his career on advocating for his clients carried significant weight with Thompson, confirming his own observations about Nathan's concerning psychological profile. As they parted, Mercer offered one final comment that Thompson would later recall as prophetic. "The truly dangerous ones aren't those who lose control, Detective. They're the ones who never lose control, who calculate every move and understand exactly how to cause maximum harm while appearing perfectly normal to the outside world." Thompson nodded in understanding, recognizing that Mercer had just described Nathan Cooper with chilling accuracy. The Juvenile Detention Center's visitation room was designed to balance security with a semblance of normalcy. Sturdy furniture bolted to the floor, cameras mounted in each corner, and a reinforced glass partition separating the guard station from the visiting area. Detective Thompson sat at one of the institutional tables, arranging materials from his case file as he waited for Nathan Cooper to be brought in for their third formal interrogation. This interview, scheduled for December 15th, had been arranged through Nathan's new lead attorney, Vivian Reese, a nationally recognized specialist in juvenile defense cases who had flown in from Chicago at the Coopers' request. Thompson had been surprised when Reese had contacted him directly, proposing another interview with her client, despite the previous refusals following Nathan's transfer hearing. "Nathan believes he can clarify certain misunderstandings," Reese had explained in her precisely professional tone, though Thompson suspected different motivations behind this sudden willingness to talk. The detective had agreed immediately, recognizing an opportunity to observe Nathan's reaction to the mounting evidence against him, particularly the DNA match that had emerged as a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. As the security door buzzed open, Thompson watched Nathan enter the room, noting subtle changes in the teenager's appearance after 2 weeks in detention, his designer clothes replaced by the facility's standard-issue jumpsuit, his carefully styled hair slightly grown out, his complexion paler from lack of sun exposure. Despite these changes, Nathan maintained the same controlled demeanor, his posture erect as he took a seat across from Thompson, his attorney settling beside him with a leather portfolio and legal pad at the ready. Vivian Reese began by establishing ground rules, her reputation as an aggressive defender immediately apparent in her precise articulation of limitations on questioning, and her reminder that she would terminate the interview at any sign of inappropriate pressure on her client. Thompson acknowledged these conditions while setting up the recording equipment, using the preparation time to observe Nathan's baseline behavior before beginning the substantive questioning. He noticed the teenager scanning the room methodically, his eyes lingering momentarily on each camera before settling on Thompson with the same analytical gaze he had displayed in previous interactions. "Nathan, thank you for agreeing to speak with me again," Thompson began once the recording was active, maintaining the professional courtesy that had characterized his approach throughout the investigation. Nathan nodded slightly, his expression neutral, as Thompson continued, "I understand you wanted to clarify some things about our previous conversations. This opening, framing the interview as Nathan's initiative rather than an interrogation, was deliberately chosen to appeal to the teenager's evident desire for control, a psychological lever Thompson had identified in their previous interactions." "Yes," Nathan responded, his voice steady, though Thompson detected a slight undercurrent of tension absent from their earlier meetings. "I believe there have been misinterpretations of certain evidence, particularly my notebook and the photographs found on my devices." Reese nodded encouragingly as Nathan delivered this clearly rehearsed opening statement, though Thompson noted she seemed slightly uncomfortable with her client's eagerness to explain himself, an unusual dynamic that suggested Nathan might be deviating from her advised strategy. Thompson began methodically, starting with less incriminating evidence before working toward the more damning DNA findings, a technique designed to build momentum through the interview. "Let's start with the notebook found under your mattress," Thompson suggested, placing photocopied pages on the table between them. These entries describe several scenarios involving revenge against people who have disrespected or humiliated the writer. "Can you explain the nature of these writings?" Nathan leaned forward slightly, appearing almost eager to address this question. "These are creative writing exercises," he explained, the same response he had given previously, but now delivered with additional context. "I've always been interested in criminal psychology, understanding how and why people commit crimes. These entries are explorations of different psychological motives, not personal fantasies." Thompson nodded, as if accepting this explanation, while noting that Nathan had clearly prepared this response during the interval between interviews. "I see," Thompson replied, maintaining a conversational tone. "And what about these surveillance photographs of Riverside Elementary School and Diego Sanchez that were recovered from your devices?" Thompson placed several printed images on the table, watching Nathan's reaction carefully. For the first time, Thompson observed genuine surprise in Nathan's expression, a momentary widening of the eyes and tensing of the jaw that suggested he hadn't been aware these deleted images had been recovered by forensics. Reese immediately intervened, placing a hand lightly on Nathan's arm as she addressed Thompson. "Detective, if you're referring to deleted files recovered through forensic analysis, we haven't been provided with this evidence as part of discovery." Thompson acknowledged this point, explaining that the analysis had only recently been completed and the findings would be formally provided to the defense team that week as required by procedure. Nathan recovered quickly from his momentary surprise, his expression returning to its usual controlled neutrality as he formulated a response. "I was working on a photography project about public spaces," he stated, after a brief consultation with his attorney. "I took photos of several locations around Billings, including parks, schools, and other public areas." The explanation was plausible on its surface, but failed to address the specific focus on Diego Sanchez evident in several of the recovered images. Thompson nodded thoughtfully before shifting to his next line of questioning. "Nathan, we've received the DNA analysis of skin cells found under Diego Sanchez's fingernails," Thompson stated, his tone remaining matter-of-fact, despite the significance of this evidence. "The DNA matches yours, indicating direct physical contact during a struggle at the time of Diego's death." Thompson placed the lab report on the table, the scientific terminology and official formatting lending visual weight to this crucial piece of evidence. Nathan's reaction was subtle but telling, a slight flaring of his nostrils and tightening around his eyes before he glanced at Reese, who appeared genuinely disturbed by this information. After a whispered consultation with his attorney, Nathan responded with a new narrative. "I did encounter Diego at the playground that day, but I didn't harm him." This admission of being at the scene, directly contradicting his previous alibi, represented a significant shift in Nathan's approach. What interrogators recognized as a minimization strategy typically employed when evidence has made complete denial untenable. Thompson maintained his neutral expression despite this breakthrough, asking calmly, "Can you tell me about this encounter?" Nathan proceeded to construct an alternative explanation. He had seen Diego alone at the playground and approached him to talk about Miguel. Diego had become frightened and scratched him during a brief struggle. Nathan had left Diego alive and well, suggesting someone else must have attacked the child after his departure. The account was carefully crafted to acknowledge the physical evidence while denying responsibility for the actual murder. Reese appeared increasingly uncomfortable as Nathan elaborated on this new version of events, suggesting to Thompson that this narrative had not been part of their preparation for the interview. Thompson recognized the strategic disadvantage this created for him. If Reese terminated the interview to regroup with her client, he would lose the momentum of Nathan's unexpected admissions. He therefore proceeded carefully, neither directly challenging Nathan's new account nor showing too much interest in its obvious inconsistencies. "Help me understand the timeline, Nathan," Thompson requested, his tone collaborative rather than confrontational. "You previously stated you were home working on a school project during this time period, but now you're saying you were at the playground speaking with Diego. What prompted this change in your recollection?" The question was deliberately framed to highlight the contradiction without directly accusing Nathan of lying, creating space for him to continue revising his narrative rather than becoming defensive. Nathan's response revealed the calculating nature Thompson had observed throughout their interactions. "I was afraid no one would believe me if I admitted being there," Nathan explained, his voice modulated to convey reasonable concern rather than guilt. "When I left, Diego was upset but completely fine. I didn't say anything before because I knew how it would look, especially after what happened with his brother at school." Thompson nodded as if considering this explanation, then shifted to a detail Nathan had not addressed. "The medical examiner found a distinctive bruising pattern on Diego's neck," Thompson stated, placing a photograph from the autopsy on the table. "The pattern matches the unusual bend in your right index finger, the result of a previous break, I believe." Thompson watched as Nathan reflexively glanced at his right hand before quickly returning his attention to the detective's face, the momentary action betraying his recognition of this damning connection. After another whispered consultation with Reese, who was now visibly concerned about the direction of the interview, Nathan attempted to incorporate this new element into his evolving narrative. "If there was contact between us, it was when I tried to calm him down after he got upset," Nathan explained, his previous confidence beginning to show subtle cracks as he struggled to account for each new piece of evidence. "He might have bumped against my hand during our interaction, but I absolutely did not strangle him." Thompson recognized the critical juncture they had reached. Nathan was now placing himself at the scene and acknowledging physical contact with Diego, significant admissions that contradicted his original alibi, but still fell short of confessing to murder. Rather than pressing harder on the physical evidence, Thompson made a tactical decision to shift to psychological territory where Nathan had previously revealed more than he intended. "Nathan, I've been thinking about something you said in our last conversation, Thompson began, leaning forward slightly to create a sense of intellectual engagement that had previously elicited Nathan's most genuine responses. You talked about true power coming from knowing what matters most to someone and being able to take that away permanently. That struck me as a particularly insightful observation about human psychology. The shift was immediately effective. Nathan straightened in his chair, his expression showing genuine interest rather than the calculated responses he had been offering regarding the physical evidence. It's a fundamental aspect of power dynamics, Nathan replied, momentarily setting aside his defensive narrative to engage with the theoretical discussion. Most people think of power in terms of physical dominance, but psychological power is far more significant. It's about understanding what truly matters to someone and controlling access to it. Thompson nodded with apparent intellectual appreciation, encouraging this line of conversation. And in your observation, what would be the most sophisticated application of that principle? Thompson asked, watching as Nathan leaned forward, his desire to demonstrate his psychological insights overriding his attorney's growing discomfort beside him. The ultimate application would be identifying what someone values above themselves, Nathan explained, his voice taking on a didactic quality that suggested he was sharing expertise rather than confessing. For most people, especially those with protective instincts, family members represent that value, particularly younger siblings or children they feel responsible for protecting. The parallels to Miguel and Diego Sanchez were unmistakable, though Nathan maintained the pretense of theoretical discussion. Reese finally intervened, placing a hand firmly on Nathan's arm and stating, "I think we need to take a break and confer privately." Thompson nodded respectfully, turning off the recording equipment as required during such consultations while making mental notes about Nathan's revelations. Through the one-way glass, Thompson could see Reese speaking intensely to Nathan, her body language suggesting she was attempting to rein in her client's apparent eagerness to demonstrate his psychological insights regardless of their incriminating nature. When the interview resumed 15 minutes later, Nathan's demeanor had noticeably changed. His responses became shorter, more controlled, and clearly aligned with standard legal strategy rather than his previous pattern of intellectual engagement. Thompson recognized that Reese had reasserted control over her client's narrative, limiting the opportunity for further unintended revelations. Nevertheless, the damage to Nathan's defense had been done. He had admitted being at the scene, acknowledged physical contact with Diego, and revealed thought patterns that aligned perfectly with the prosecution's theory of calculated psychological revenge against Miguel Sanchez. Thompson concluded the interview after another 30 minutes of increasingly unproductive questioning, thanking Nathan and Attorney Reese for their time while maintaining his professional demeanor despite the significant breakthroughs achieved. As Nathan was escorted back to his cell, Thompson noticed a brief interaction between the teenager and his attorney. Nathan appeared annoyed rather than concerned, while Reese's expression suggested growing doubts about her client that went beyond the typical attorney-client relationship. Back at the station, Thompson met with Assistant District Attorney Chen to review the recording and discuss the implications of Nathan's admissions. He's changed his story from complete denial to admitting he was there and had physical contact with Diego, Thompson summarized. And his comments about power and targeting what someone values most are essentially a theoretical description of exactly what he did to Miguel by killing Diego. Chen nodded, her expression grim as she considered these developments. It's unusual for a defendant to undermine their own defense this way, she observed. Most people in Nathan's position would be minimizing their involvement or emphasizing mitigating factors like age or emotional state. Thompson agreed, explaining his assessment that Nathan's intellectual pride, his desire to be recognized for his psychological insights had temporarily overridden his self-preservation instincts during the interview. "What concerns me most isn't just that he killed Diego," Thompson added, after a thoughtful pause. "It's that he seems to view this whole process, the investigation, the legal proceedings, even these interviews, as some kind of intellectual challenge or game." Chen nodded in understanding, recognizing the implications of this assessment, not just for their case, but for the broader question of Nathan's fundamental danger to society, regardless of age. The interview had achieved something beyond gathering admissions about physical evidence. It had revealed Nathan Cooper's continuing lack of remorse or empathy, his view of the legal process as an intellectual challenge rather than a reckoning with a horrific act, and perhaps most disturbingly, his enduring pride in the psychological sophistication of his crime. These revelations would prove crucial in the coming trial, providing context for the physical evidence and helping the jury understand not just what Nathan had done, but the calculated cruelty behind his actions, the deliberate choice to destroy not just Diego's life, but Miguel's sense of security and family through an act of sophisticated psychological torture disguised as simple murder. The Yellowstone County Courthouse stood as a monument to judicial authority in downtown Billings, its limestone facade and classical columns projecting an aura of permanence and impartiality. On the morning of March 10, 2025, the building was surrounded by news vans and reporters, their satellite dishes raised like mechanical flowers tracking the winter sun. Detective Thompson navigated through the media encampment, nodding to officers maintaining the perimeter as he climbed the broad steps into the building where the trial of Nathan Cooper was set to begin after 3 months of pre-trial motions, jury selection challenges, and legal maneuvering by both sides. Inside the designated courtroom, Thompson observed the careful staging that had preceded the jury's arrival, the Sanchez family seated directly behind the prosecution table, their faces composed but bearing the unmistakable hollowness of grief. The Cooper family positioned with similar precision behind the defense, James and Elizabeth flanking an empty chair reserved for their son, both attorneys dressed in subtle, expensive clothing that projected respectability without ostentation. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Chen was arranging documents at the prosecution table, her methodical organization reflecting her preparation for what promised to be a challenging case, despite the strong evidence they had accumulated. The defense table presented a stark contrast to the prosecution's utilitarian arrangement. 3 attorneys from the high-profile Chicago firm that had replaced Jonathan Mercer were setting up an elaborate electronic display system, their movements practiced and efficient, as they prepared multimedia presentations designed to counter the physical evidence with alternative narratives. Vivian Reese, now leading Nathan's defense team, had built her national reputation on sophisticated psychological defenses for juvenile offenders, often employing expert witnesses to emphasize brain development and environmental factors rather than directly challenging physical evidence. At precisely 8:45 a.m., Nathan Cooper was escorted into the courtroom through a side door, the standard orange jumpsuit of pre-trial detention replaced by a carefully selected outfit, khaki slacks, a blue button-down shirt, and a muted tie that emphasized his youth and student status. Thompson noted that Nathan's hair had been cut recently, styled to appear more boyish than the mature look he had maintained before his arrest, part of an obvious strategy to remind the jury of his chronological age despite the court's decision to try him as an adult. Thompson watched as Nathan greeted his parents with practiced filial affection before taking his seat between Reese and her co-counsel, his movements composed and his expression appropriately serious for the occasion. Only someone who had observed Nathan as closely as Thompson had would notice the subtle signs of his true state, the calculating assessment in his eyes as he scanned the courtroom, the tension in his voice, the uncertainty in his step. Thompson the momentary tightening of his jaw when he spotted Miguel Sanchez seated with his family, the fleeting satisfaction that crossed his face when he noticed the media attention focused on the proceedings. Judge Lawrence Harding entered the courtroom at 9 a.m. precisely, his reputation for running efficient, procedurally meticulous trials, ensuring that both prosecution and defense were fully prepared as he called the court to order. The jury was brought in, 8 women and 4 men selected after an exhaustive process that had eliminated potential jurors with strong opinions about juvenile justice or connections to either family. Thompson studied their faces as they settled into the jury box, noting the mix of apprehension and resolve typical of citizens confronting a high-profile murder case involving a defendant so young. Rebecca Chen's opening statement was methodically constructed to establish both the timeline of events and the psychological framework for understanding Nathan's actions. "This case is about calculated revenge," Chen began, her voice clear and deliberate. "Not a momentary loss of control, not a teenage impulse, but a sophisticated plan designed to cause maximum suffering." Chen outlined how Nathan, humiliated by Miguel Sanchez, had deliberately targeted Miguel's younger brother as the perfect vehicle for revenge, planning and executing the murder with a level of premeditation that belied his chronological age. Chen methodically walked the jury through the evidence they would hear. Marcus Webb's eyewitness testimony placing Nathan at the scene, the DNA evidence found under Diego's fingernails, the distinctive bruising pattern matching Nathan's deformed finger, the surveillance photos showing Nathan had stalked Diego for weeks, the internet searches about strangulation techniques, the notebook containing detailed revenge fantasies, and perhaps most damning, Nathan's own admissions during his third interview with Detective Thompson that he had been at the playground and had physical contact with Diego shortly before the child's death. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen concluded, her tone grave, "the evidence will show that Nathan Cooper strangled 8-year-old Diego Sanchez not in a moment of teenage impulse, but as the culmination of a carefully calculated plan to inflict maximum psychological damage on Miguel Sanchez. This was not just the taking of an innocent child's life, it was psychological torture by proxy, executed with a level of sophistication that demonstrates full understanding of the nature and consequences of these actions." Vivian Reese's opening statement presented a stark contrast to Chen's methodical presentation of evidence, focusing instead on creating an alternative psychological framework for understanding Nathan's actions and statements. "The prosecution has constructed a narrative of calculation and adult-level premeditation," Reese acknowledged, her voice carrying the polished resonance of extensive courtroom experience. "But what they've failed to consider is the fundamental neurological reality of adolescent brain development and how trauma shapes teenage perception and behavior." Reese outlined how the defense would present expert testimony on adolescent brain development, emphasizing that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and understanding long-term consequences, remains undeveloped until the mid-20s. She skillfully reframed Nathan's notebook writings not as evidence of premeditation, but as therapeutic processing of normal teenage social anxiety, and suggested that his surveillance photos were part of a misguided attempt to understand Miguel's family dynamics, rather than stalking. Most significantly, Reese directly addressed Nathan's admissions during his third interview with Detective Thompson, characterizing them as a frightened teenager attempting to sound sophisticated under psychological pressure from an experienced detective. She promised the jury would hear expert testimony about interrogation-induced false narratives and how adolescents often create stories that seem to align with evidence presented to them by authority figures. Thompson watched the jury during both opening statements, noting how several members appeared particularly affected by Chen's description of Diego's final moments. while others seemed receptive to Reese's emphasis on Nathan's youth and brain development. The detective recognized that despite the strong physical evidence connecting Nathan to the murder, the case would ultimately hinge on which psychological framework the jury accepted: Nathan as a calculating killer whose age belied his sophisticated understanding, or Nathan as an immature teenager whose actions and statements needed to be viewed through the lens of neurological development. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders and crime scene technicians who established the basic facts of Diego's murder: the location, position of the body, evidence collection procedures, and preliminary findings at the scene. Dr. Sarah Reynolds, the medical examiner, provided detailed testimony about the cause of death, demonstrating with anatomical models how the distinctive bruising pattern on Diego's neck matched a hand with a deformed right index finger consistent with Nathan's. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Reynolds stated, indicating specific photographs in evidence, "the bruising pattern shows that the assailant strangled the victim face-to-face, maintaining direct eye contact during the approximately 2 to 3 minutes it would take for death to occur through manual strangulation." This testimony visibly affected several jurors who appeared disturbed by the implication of such intimate, sustained violence against a child. The defense cross-examination focused on alternative explanations for the bruising pattern and the possibility that the deformity in the assailant's finger might match others besides Nathan. But Dr. Reynolds remained firm in her assessment that the pattern was distinctive enough to be highly probative. Reese also attempted to establish that the face-to-face strangulation might indicate a crime of passion rather than calculated murder. But Dr. Reynolds countered that the sustained force required for strangulation inherently involved continued choice, rather than momentary impulse. Marcus Webb's testimony provided the crucial eyewitness account, placing Nathan at the scene, his description of seeing the teenager leaving the playground area in disheveled clothing corresponding with the estimated time of Diego's death. Webb also testified about Nathan's subsequent attempt to bribe and threaten him, recounting how Nathan had approached him 2 days after the murder, whispered, "I know where you sleep," and slipped him $50 to remain silent. Defense counsel attacked Webb's credibility aggressively, highlighting a 15-year-old conviction for check fraud and suggesting he had fabricated the bribery allegation to gain favorable treatment regarding an unrelated probation violation. Webb maintained his account despite this pressure, his demeanor remaining steady as he described the unsettling calm with which Nathan had attempted to ensure his silence, like a boss giving instructions to an employee, Webb explained, not like a scared kid trying to cover something up. The prosecution's technological evidence proved particularly compelling, with forensic experts testifying about the surveillance photos recovered from Nathan's devices, showing weeks of observation of Diego's movements, the internet searches about strangulation techniques specific to children's anatomy, and the deleted text messages referencing making Miguel suffer permanently. The defense attempted to contextualize these digital artifacts as misinterpreted normal teenage behavior, suggesting the surveillance was for a photography project, the searches were for a biology paper, the texts referring to social rather than physical suffering. But the cumulative impact on the jury appeared significant based on their increasingly troubled expressions. Detective Thompson's testimony about his interviews with Nathan became a central focus of both the prosecution and defense strategies. Chen methodically walked Thompson through each interview, establishing the evolution of Nathan's statements from complete denial to admitting presence at the scene and physical contact with Diego. Thompson described Nathan's unusual composure throughout these interactions, his sophisticated understanding of psychological power dynamics, and his apparent intellectual pride in discussing theoretical aspects of revenge that aligned perfectly with the method and motive of Diego's murder. In my 20 years of law enforcement experience, Thompson testified, I've never encountered a teenage suspect who maintained such consistent emotional control or demonstrated such sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. Thompson detailed how Nathan had appeared most engaged not when defending himself against accusations, but when explaining his theories about psychological power and revenge, as if he viewed the interviews as an opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual superiority rather than as a serious legal proceeding with life-altering consequences. Reese's cross-examination of Thompson was aggressive and sophisticated, attempting to reframe his observations of Nathan's behavior through the lens of adolescent psychology and stress responses. Isn't it true, Detective Thompson, that teenagers often mask fear with bravado? Reese asked, establishing a line of questioning that suggested Nathan's composed demeanor represented psychological defense mechanisms rather than genuine calm. And isn't it also true that adolescents, particularly high-achieving ones, often attempt to impress authority figures by theorizing and intellectualizing when they feel threatened? Thompson acknowledged these general possibilities while maintaining that Nathan's behavior differed qualitatively from typical teenage coping mechanisms he had observed throughout his career. There's a difference between a teenager putting on a brave face and what I observed in Nathan Cooper, Thompson explained. Most adolescents, even those attempting to appear tough, show micro-expressions of fear, anxiety, or distress when discussing serious accusations. Nathan showed none of these. Instead, he displayed what I would describe as intellectual engagement and occasional satisfaction when he believed he had made a particularly insightful point. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Nathan's classmates about his behavior before and after Diego's murder, with Emma Lawson describing how Nathan had calmly completed calculus homework while other students discussed the shocking local murder, and Tyler Rodriguez recounting how he had observed Nathan practicing different emotional expressions in the bathroom mirror the day after Diego's body was discovered. These accounts contributed to the prosecution's portrayal of Nathan as someone fundamentally different from typical teenagers, someone calculating rather than impulsive, someone who needed to rehearse appropriate emotional responses rather than experiencing them naturally. By the end of the prosecution's case, the evidence against Nathan appeared overwhelming. Physical evidence placing him at the scene, DNA under the victim's fingernails, digital evidence showing premeditation, eyewitness testimony about his presence and subsequent attempt at witness tampering, and psychological evidence suggesting sophisticated understanding of the impact his actions would have. Thompson observed the jury as Chen rested the prosecution's case, noting their solemn expressions and troubled glances toward Nathan, who maintained the same composed, attentive demeanor he had displayed throughout the proceedings. The defense case began with a series of expert witnesses on adolescent brain development, each emphasizing that teenagers, even intelligent, high-achieving ones, lack fully developed capacity for impulse control, risk assessment, and understanding long-term consequences. Dr. Gregory Martinez, a prominent neuropsychologist, presented colorful brain scans contrasting adolescent and adult brains, using these visual aids to argue that, regardless of how adult-like Nathan may appear, his neurological hardware simply cannot process information, particularly emotional information, the way an adult brain does. Reese skillfully used these experts to reframe each piece of evidence presented by the prosecution. The notebook writings became fantasy as psychological processing, the surveillance photos obsessive but developmentally normal fixation, the internet searches morbid curiosity typical of adolescents exploring boundaries, and Nathan's composed demeanor, a stress response masking profound fear and confusion. Each expert was well-credentialed and articulate, creating a coherent alternative framework for interpreting Nathan's actions that emphasized his chronological age over his apparent psychological sophistication. James and Elizabeth Cooper testified as character witnesses, both abandoning their usual professional detachment to present emotional accounts of Nathan as a loving son, dedicated student, and fundamentally good person who had never shown violent tendencies. Elizabeth described Nathan's volunteer work at a local animal shelter, while James recounted how Nathan had helped a new student who was being bullied at school, carefully constructed anecdotes designed to counter the prosecution's portrayal of Nathan as lacking empathy or normal emotional responses. Thompson observed that while the Coopers' testimony appeared genuinely emotional, Nathan himself showed minimal reaction to his parents' evident distress, a disconnect that several jurors seemed to notice based on their thoughtful glances between the emotional parents and their composed son. This subtle dynamic underscored the central tension of the case, the contrast between how Nathan was portrayed by others and how he actually presented himself in the courtroom. As the defense case neared its conclusion, speculation grew about whether Nathan himself would testify, a high-risk decision in any murder trial, but particularly complex given his previous admissions to Detective Thompson and his unusual psychological presentation. Legal analysts commenting on the case for local news suggested that Reese would be reluctant to subject her client to cross-examination given his tendency to engage intellectually with questions about revenge psychology in ways that might undermine their defense narrative of adolescent impulsivity. On the morning of March 24th, 2 weeks into the trial, Reese announced that Nathan Cooper would indeed take the stand in his own defense. The courtroom fell silent as Nathan was sworn in, his demeanor appropriately serious, though Thompson noted the subtle signs of what appeared to be anticipation rather than anxiety as he settled into the witness chair. Reese began with carefully structured questions designed to establish Nathan as a typical teenager. Questions about school, hobbies, friends, and future aspirations that allowed him to present himself as relatable to the jury. Nathan's testimony, delivered in a clear, measured voice, followed the defense narrative with remarkable consistency. He acknowledged being at the playground and having a brief interaction with Diego Sanchez, but denied strangling the child, suggesting someone else must have attacked Diego after he left. He explained his notebook writings as creative exercises exploring psychological concepts for advanced placement psychology class, and described the surveillance photos as part of a photography project documenting public spaces and the people who use them. Most notably, Nathan directly addressed his previous admissions to Detective Thompson, claiming he had felt pressured to sound more sophisticated and knowledgeable than he actually was. "I thought if I sounded smart enough, Detective Thompson would believe me when I said I didn't kill Diego," Nathan explained, in what appeared to be a rehearsed but effective moment of vulnerability. "I was trying to impress him with theories I'd read about in psychology books because I was scared and didn't know what else to do." Rebecca Chen's cross-examination was methodical and relentless, focusing first on establishing the multiple contradictions in Nathan's evolving accounts before directly challenging his explanations for the evidence against him. "Nathan, you've provided 3 entirely different explanations for where you were when Diego Sanchez was murdered," Chen stated, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "First, you said you were home working on a project, then you said you were taking a walk but never saw Diego, and now you're saying you had a brief interaction with him but left him alive. Why should the jury believe this latest version when you've already changed your story twice?" Nathan's response revealed the first cracks in his composed facade, a flash of irritation quickly suppressed, as he explained that he had been confused and scared during his initial interviews. Chen pressed further, asking why surveillance photos focusing specifically on Diego over a 3-week period would be necessary for a general photography project about public spaces Why internet searches about children's neck anatomy would be relevant to a biology assignment that Nathan's teachers had confirmed was never assigned. And most pointedly, why Nathan had approached Marcus Webb with money and a threat if his interaction with Diego had been innocent. As Chen's cross-examination continued into its second hour, Thompson observed Nathan's demeanor gradually shifting, his initial composure giving way to increasing tension as Chen methodically dismantled each alternative explanation he offered. The turning point came when Chen projected a page from Nathan's notebook onto the courtroom's large monitor, displaying a detailed entry about using collateral damage to inflict psychological rather than physical pain on someone who thinks they're untouchable. Nathan, this entry is dated 2 days after your altercation with Miguel Sanchez, Chen stated, allowing the jury to read the text as she spoke. You wrote about identifying the person they feel responsible for protecting as the perfect target for true revenge. How do you explain this timing and the specific strategy that exactly matches what happened to Diego Sanchez and the impact it had on his brother Miguel? For the first time in the trial, Nathan appeared genuinely flustered, glancing toward his attorneys before attempting to regain his composure with a response about theoretical scenarios that sounded hollow even to his own ears based on his subsequent expression of frustration. Chen pressed her advantage, moving quickly through additional notebook entries that, while never naming the Sanchez brothers specifically, created a clear progression of revenge planning that aligned precisely with the timeline between Nathan's humiliation by Miguel and Diego's murder. As the cross-examination concluded, Thompson observed that several jurors were now openly studying Nathan with expressions ranging from concern to evident distrust, their perception clearly affected by witnessing the contradictions in his testimony and his increasingly transparent attempts to craft explanations that strained credibility. Nathan returned to the defense table visibly frustrated, not with remorse or the emotional distress typical of a teenager confronting serious accusations, but with what Thompson recognized as the irritation of someone whose carefully constructed narrative had been effectively challenged. In closing arguments, Chen synthesized the physical evidence, digital forensics, eyewitness testimony, and psychological assessments into a cohesive narrative of calculated revenge, emphasizing that while Nathan's brain might not be fully developed in all areas, the sophisticated planning and execution of Diego's murder demonstrated clear understanding of the nature and consequences of his actions. Nathan Cooper didn't kill Diego Sanchez in a moment of teenage impulse, Chen concluded, her voice carrying throughout the now silent courtroom. He selected him as the perfect target to hurt Miguel, planned the murder over weeks, executed it with precision, and attempted to cover his tracks afterward. Actions that demonstrate the kind of calculation and understanding that justify holding him responsible as an adult under the law. Reese's closing argument returned to the themes of adolescent brain development and the legal system's responsibility to consider Nathan's age despite the court's decision to try him as an adult. Even if you believe Nathan committed this terrible act, Reese told the jury, her tone both compassionate and challenging, you must consider whether a 16-year-old with a still developing brain truly understood the permanence and significance of his actions in the way an adult would. Reese emphasized the potential for rehabilitation, the documented neurological differences between adolescent and adult decision-making, and the legal principle that culpability is directly related to capacity for understanding. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations on the afternoon of March 26th, Thompson watched Nathan return to the holding cell, noting that the teenager's composed demeanor had largely returned after the momentary frustration displayed during cross-examination. The detective had observed countless defendants awaiting jury decisions during his career, and Nathan's apparent lack of anxiety struck him as particularly telling, Most defendants, regardless of guilt or innocence, showed significant stress during this period of uncertainty, but Nathan appeared almost curious about the outcome, as if observing an experiment rather than awaiting a decision that would determine the course of his life. The jury deliberations in the Nathan Cooper trial extended through 4 days of intense discussion, the length suggesting significant debate among the 12 citizens tasked with determining the teenager's fate. Detective Thompson spent these days catching up on other cases and preparing for potential outcomes, though he found his thoughts repeatedly returning to the calculating teenager whose actions had revealed a darkness rarely seen even in his 20 years of homicide investigations. On the morning of March 31, 2025, the court received notice that the jury had reached a verdict, and Thompson made his way to the courthouse through a gauntlet of media that had grown with each day of the high-profile trial. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity as Judge Harding called the court to order, the tension palpable as the jury filed in, their expressions grave and several showing signs of emotional exhaustion from their deliberations. Thompson observed the key participants as they awaited the verdict, the Sanchez family holding hands in silent prayer, James and Elizabeth Cooper maintaining their professional composure, though Elizabeth's knuckles were white as she gripped her husband's hand, Assistant District Attorney Chen sitting perfectly straight with her notes arranged precisely before her, and Vivian Reese leaning slightly toward Nathan, as if preparing to provide immediate counsel regardless of the outcome. Nathan himself presented the same composed demeanor he had maintained throughout most of the trial, though Thompson noticed subtle signs of heightened alertness, a slight tension in his posture, a more focused quality to his gaze as he watched the jury foreman stand with the verdict form. Judge Harding instructed Nathan to rise as the verdict was read, and, for the first time, Thompson observed what appeared to be genuine anticipation breaking through the teenager's carefully maintained facade. In the case of the state of Montana versus Nathan James Cooper on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant. The foreman paused, clearing his throat before continuing with firm resolve. Guilty. A collective exhalation seemed to pass through the courtroom, followed by Maria Sanchez's quiet sob of vindication and Elizabeth Cooper's sharp intake of breath. Nathan himself showed minimal reaction beyond a slight tightening of his jaw and a momentary narrowing of his eyes before his expression returned to its usual controlled neutrality. Judge Harding thanked the jury for their service and announced that sentencing would be scheduled for 2 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentencing reports and impact statements to be prepared. As Nathan was led from the courtroom by court officers, Thompson noticed something that troubled him more than any previous observation of the teenager, a brief moment when Nathan turned toward Miguel Sanchez in the gallery and made deliberate eye contact, his expression neither threatening nor remorseful, but containing something Thompson could only describe as satisfaction, as if some private contest between them had reached its conclusion regardless of the verdict. The 2 weeks between verdict and sentencing saw intense activity from both prosecution and defense. The Cooper family hired a specialized sentencing consultant to prepare materials emphasizing Nathan's youth, potential for rehabilitation, and the neurological arguments that had formed the core of their defense. Vivian Reese filed a substantial brief arguing for the minimum possible sentence under Montana law for a juvenile tried as an adult, citing numerous cases where courts had recognized the diminished culpability of adolescent offenders despite the severity of their crimes. The prosecution prepared equally comprehensive materials arguing for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the calculated nature of Diego's murder, the extensive premeditation, the targeting of a child victim specifically to cause psychological suffering to his brother, and perhaps most significantly, Nathan's continued lack of remorse or emotional recognition of the gravity of his actions. Chen also worked with the Sanchez family to prepare impact statements that would communicate to the court the devastating effect Diego's murder had on his parents, siblings, and the broader community. Thompson contributed a detailed assessment for the pre-sentencing report, documenting his observations of Nathan's behavior throughout the investigation and trial, the calculated responses during interrogations, the intellectual engagement when discussing revenge psychology, the apparent satisfaction when making eye contact with Miguel after the verdict, and the consistent absence of emotional responses typical of teenagers facing serious legal consequences. Thompson framed these observations not as personal judgments, but as professional assessments relevant to considerations of rehabilitation potential and ongoing risk to society. On the morning of April 14, 2025, the courtroom was again filled to capacity for Nathan Cooper's sentencing hearing. The proceedings began with victim impact statements, starting with Carlos Sanchez, Diego's father, who spoke in a voice steady despite his evident grief. Diego was our youngest, our baby, Carlos stated, his hands gripping the podium as he addressed the court. He loved dinosaurs and wanted to be a paleontologist. He had just lost his front tooth the week before he was killed. These simple details of Diego's interrupted childhood affected the courtroom profoundly, juxtaposing the ordinary markers of an 8-year-old's life with the horrific manner of his death. Maria Sanchez spoke next, describing the empty chair at their dinner table, the bedroom they couldn't bear to enter, and the younger children asking when Diego would come home, concrete examples of the ongoing devastation that rippled through their family with each passing day. Thompson observed Nathan during these statements, noting that while the teenager maintained an appropriately solemn expression, his eyes showed none of the emotional response that typically manifested even in hardened adult offenders when confronted with the human impact of their actions. The most powerful impact statement came from Miguel Sanchez, who approached the podium with visible determination, his voice initially unsteady but gaining strength as he addressed the court. "I was supposed to protect him," Miguel began, the simple statement conveying the crushing weight of survivor's guilt he carried. "Every day I think about what would have happened if I hadn't stood up to Nathan, if I had just let him bully me and the other freshmen. My little brother would still be alive." Miguel described how he had been unable to return to school, how he woke screaming from nightmares where he found Diego's body, how he felt responsible despite everyone telling him Nathan's actions were not his fault. "The worst part is knowing that this is exactly what Nathan wanted," Miguel continued, looking directly at Nathan for the first time during his statement. "He didn't just want to hurt me physically, he wanted to break me completely, to give me something I could never recover from. And he succeeded." This stark assessment of Nathan's psychological strategy visibly affected many in the courtroom, including several jurors who had returned to observe the sentencing as it crystallized the calculated cruelty at the heart of the crime. Defense counsel presented their sentencing arguments next, with Vivian Reese emphasizing scientific research on adolescent brain development, the documented capacity for rehabilitation in juvenile offenders, and numerous Supreme Court decisions recognizing that children are constitutionally different from adults in their level of culpability. Reese introduced testimony from Dr. Lawrence Patel, a renowned expert in juvenile rehabilitation, who presented statistical evidence showing that even teenagers who commit serious violent crimes have significantly lower recidivism rates than adults when provided with appropriate intervention programs. James and Elizabeth Cooper both addressed the court as character witnesses during the sentencing phase, their professional composure finally breaking as they pleaded for mercy for their son. Elizabeth described Nathan as a child who made a terrible mistake and begged the court to see the scared 16-year-old boy beneath the prosecution's portrayal, while James emphasized Nathan's academic achievements and potential future contributions to society if given the opportunity for rehabilitation rather than extended incarceration. When Nathan himself was offered the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, a critical moment in any criminal proceeding, his statement revealed the fundamental disconnect that had troubled Thompson throughout the investigation. "I want to express my condolences to the Sanchez family for their loss," Nathan began, his voice steady and his phrasing formal, as if delivering a prepared speech rather than an emotional appeal. "I maintain that I did not kill Diego, but I understand the jury has found otherwise, and I respect the legal process that led to that conclusion." Thompson observed that Nathan's statement contained the expected elements: acknowledgement of the victim's family, respect for the court's process, but lacked any authentic emotional content or genuine recognition of the human impact of Diego's death. Most tellingly, Nathan never directly addressed Miguel or the specific suffering his brother's murder had caused him, a glaring omission given Miguel's powerful impact statement just hours earlier. Assistant District Attorney Chen's sentencing argument emphasized this continued lack of remorse or emotional recognition, arguing that it demonstrated Nathan's fundamental danger to society regardless of his age. "Your Honor, throughout this entire process, from investigation through trial and even today at sentencing, Nathan Cooper has demonstrated a disturbing absence of empathy or remorse," Chen stated, her voice firm with conviction. "This is not typical teenage behavior, not even for a teenager who has committed a serious crime. This is something fundamentally different and more concerning." Chen methodically outlined the aggravating factors justifying maximum sentencing: the calculated nature of the crime, the extensive premeditation, the targeting of a particularly vulnerable victim, the attempt to intimidate a witness, and perhaps most significantly, the psychological sophistication of targeting Diego specifically to cause maximum suffering to Miguel, what Chen characterized as murder as psychological torture by proxy. She concluded by arguing that while rehabilitation should always be considered for juvenile offenders, the nature of Nathan's crime and his continued lack of authentic remorse suggested rehabilitation prospects were limited at best. Judge Harding called a brief recess before delivering his sentencing decision, leaving the courtroom in tense anticipation. Thompson used this time to observe Nathan's interaction with his parents and legal team, noting that while James and Elizabeth appeared increasingly distraught as sentencing approached, Nathan himself maintained the same composed demeanor, occasionally nodding at points made by his attorneys, but showing none of the fear or anxiety that would be expected from a teenager facing potentially decades in prison. When court resumed, Judge Harding began his sentencing statement with a thoughtful acknowledgement of the competing considerations before him: the scientific evidence regarding adolescent brain development, the legal precedents regarding juvenile sentencing, the particularly calculated nature of the crime, and the ongoing impact on the Sanchez family and broader community. "In my 30 years on the bench," Judge Harding stated, his voice carrying the weight of long experience, "I have sentenced hundreds of defendants, including many juveniles tried as adults. Each case presents its unique challenges, but few have troubled me as deeply as this one." Judge Harding acknowledged the defense's arguments regarding Nathan's age and brain development, but noted that these considerations needed to be balanced against the specific nature of the crime. "What distinguishes this case is not merely the taking of a child's life, as devastating as that is," Judge Harding explained, "but the calculated psychological strategy behind that action, the deliberate selection of Diego Sanchez, not randomly, but specifically because his murder would cause maximum psychological suffering to his brother Miguel." The judge directly addressed Nathan, who stood flanked by his defense team as sentencing was delivered. "Mr. Cooper, throughout this trial I have observed your demeanor carefully. I have listened to the evidence regarding your planning, your actions after the murder, and your statements during police interviews. What troubles me most deeply is not just what you did, but your fundamental inability or unwillingness to recognize the human cost of your actions." Judge Harding's expression hardened as he continued, his voice taking on an edge that Thompson had rarely heard from the typically measured jurist. "I have searched for signs of the adolescent impulsivity that your attorneys have argued should mitigate your culpability. But what the evidence shows instead is a calculated crime carried out with sophisticated psychological understanding and a complete absence of empathy for your victim or his family." The courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Harding leaned forward, his next words delivered with unmistakable intensity. "I want to see you die in prison, Mr. Cooper." The blunt statement sent a shock through the courtroom, the judge's departure from judicial restraint revealing the profound impact Nathan's case had made on even this experienced jurist. After a moment, Judge Harding continued with more measured language, "However, the law requires that I consider your age as a mitigating factor despite the adult nature of your crime." Judge Harding then delivered the formal sentence. "Nathan James Cooper, having been found guilty of murder in the first degree, this court sentences you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The sentence, the maximum available under Montana law for a 16-year-old tried as an adult, reflected the judge's assessment of both the calculated nature of the crime and Nathan's continued failure to demonstrate genuine remorse or recognition of the human impact of his actions." As the sentence was pronounced, Thompson observed the various reactions throughout the courtroom, the Sanchez family embracing in tearful vindication, Elizabeth Cooper collapsing against her husband's shoulder, members of the jury nodding in solemn agreement with the judge's decision. Most notably, Thompson watched Nathan's reaction to hearing his fate, the teenager's expression registering not fear or despair, but what appeared to be mild surprise, followed by a rapid recalculation, his eyes already moving to his attorneys as if assessing appeal options even before being led from the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Detective Thompson, seeking his reaction to the sentence and his reflections on the case that had captivated Montana for months. Thompson provided measured responses, emphasizing the strength of the evidence while acknowledging the tragedy affecting both families, the Sanchez family who had lost their youngest child, and the Coopers who now faced their son spending potentially his entire life in prison. What Thompson didn't share with the media was his private assessment of Nathan Cooper, not just as the perpetrator of a horrific crime, but as someone whose fundamental psychological makeup had allowed him to target a child for murder as part of a calculated strategy to cause psychological suffering, someone who had maintained emotional detachment throughout investigation and trial, and someone who had shown satisfaction rather than remorse when making eye contact with Miguel Sanchez after the guilty verdict was announced. In the days following sentencing, Thompson met with the Sanchez family at their request, answering their lingering questions about the investigation and the evidence that had led to Nathan's conviction. During this conversation in their modest living room, surrounded by family photos including prominent images of Diego, Maria Sanchez asked the question that had troubled her throughout the trial. "Detective Thompson, you spent more time with Nathan Cooper than anyone else investigating this case. Do you think he feels any regret at all for what he did to our son?" Thompson considered his response carefully, balancing professional objectivity with the family's need for honest closure. "In my professional experience, Mrs. Sanchez, Nathan Cooper views emotions differently than most people," Thompson finally answered. "I don't believe he experiences regret or remorse in the way we would expect, not because he's a teenager, but because of fundamental differences in how he processes the impact of his actions on others." This assessment, delivered with compassion but unflinching honesty, provided the Sanchez family with the difficult truth they needed to begin their long process of healing, the recognition that Diego's murder had not been a momentary teenage impulse, but a calculated act by someone whose psychological makeup allowed him to view the taking of a child's life as an acceptable means to an end. The Montana State Prison stood isolated against the backdrop of rolling hills outside Deer Lodge, its concrete walls and razor wire perimeter a stark contrast to the natural beauty surrounding it. 6 months after Nathan Cooper's sentencing, Detective Richard Thompson drove through the facility's main gate, having arranged a final interview with the now 17-year-old convicted murderer. This unusual request had been approved after consultation with prison authorities, the district attorney's office, and Nathan's new appellate attorney, with the understanding that Thompson was conducting follow-up investigation for case closure rather than seeking additional evidence. Thompson had requested this interview for reasons that went beyond standard procedure. Throughout the investigation and trial, he had been troubled by the calculated nature of Nathan's crime and his apparent lack of emotional response to its consequences. As an experienced detective who had encountered hundreds of violent offenders, Thompson recognized in Nathan something fundamentally different from typical juvenile criminals, something that standard legal and psychological frameworks struggled to adequately capture or address. The prison's interview room was austere and utilitarian, designed for security rather than comfort, with bolted-down furniture and observation windows allowing guards to monitor interactions without hearing confidential conversations. Thompson waited at the metal table, reviewing his notes one final time before the door opened and Nathan Cooper entered, escorted by a corrections officer who remained just outside after removing Nathan's handcuffs as a professional courtesy requested by Thompson. 6 months of incarceration had changed Nathan's appearance in subtle ways. The designer clothes replaced by standard prison attire, his previously styled hair now cut in the institutional short crop, his complexion paler from limited outdoor access. Despite these surface changes, Thompson immediately noted that Nathan's fundamental demeanor remained unchanged. The same controlled composure, the same analytical gaze assessing his surroundings, the same absence of the emotional wear typically evident in teenagers adapting to prison life. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me, Nathan," Thompson began, maintaining the professional courtesy that had characterized his approach throughout their interactions. Nathan nodded slightly in acknowledgement, settling into the chair across from Thompson with the same measured movements he had displayed during their interviews before and during the trial. "I was surprised by your request," Nathan responded, his voice carrying the same articulate precision Thompson remembered. "Most detectives don't follow up after conviction and sentencing." Thompson acknowledged this observation with a slight nod, explaining that he sometimes conducted closure interviews in cases that presented unusual psychological aspects. "Your case has certain elements that I'm still trying to understand fully," Thompson stated, watching Nathan's reaction carefully, not the evidence or the legal outcome, but the psychological dynamics that led to your actions. This framing, appealing to Nathan's evident interest in psychological analysis, was deliberately chosen to encourage engagement rather than defensiveness. The strategy proved effective as Nathan leaned forward slightly, his expression showing the same intellectual interest he had displayed when discussing theoretical aspects of revenge psychology during their previous interviews. "You mean why I supposedly targeted Diego rather than confronting Miguel directly," Nathan stated, maintaining his formal denial of guilt despite the conviction while engaging with the psychological premise of Thompson's inquiry. From an analytical perspective, it's an interesting question regardless of my actual involvement. Thompson noted this characteristic response, Nathan's continued technical denial coupled with evident pride in discussing the psychological sophistication of the crime, before steering the conversation toward Nathan's adjustment to prison life. "How are you adapting to your current situation?" Thompson asked, genuinely curious about how someone with Nathan's psychological profile was navigating the harsh realities of incarceration at such a young age. Nathan's response revealed his fundamental difference from typical juvenile offenders. "I've established a productive routine," he explained with clinical detachment, I've enrolled in correspondence courses, maintained physical fitness through the limited exercise options, and identified strategic alliances with certain inmates and staff who provide necessary protection and privileges. The description was devoid of the emotional language most incarcerated teenagers used. No mention of missing family, struggling with confinement, or grappling with the reality of potentially decades behind bars. Thompson nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that Nathan was approaching prison as he had approached every other aspect of his case, as a strategic challenge to be analyzed and managed, rather than an emotional reality to be processed. "Have you had any contact with your parents since sentencing?" Thompson asked, knowing that James and Elizabeth Cooper had immediately begun pursuing appeals while also engaging specialized attorneys to arrange transfers to juvenile facilities with better educational and therapeutic programs. "They visit weekly," Nathan replied matter-of-factly. "They've hired new appellate counsel and are pursuing several legal strategies focused on my age at the time of the alleged crime." Thompson noted Nathan's use of alleged despite his conviction, a subtle but consistent maintenance of technical innocence that contradicted his evident pride in the psychological sophistication of Diego's murder. Most striking to Thompson was Nathan's description of his parents' efforts as separate from his own experience. They're pursuing rather than we're pursuing, suggesting a curious detachment from even those most dedicated to securing his freedom. Thompson shifted the conversation toward the central question that had brought him to the prison, approaching it indirectly through a broader inquiry about Nathan's reflections since conviction. "During the months you've been here, have you had thoughts about Diego Sanchez or the impact of his death on his family?" Thompson asked, his tone remaining conversational rather than accusatory, despite the gravity of the question. Nathan's response was revealing in its calculated nature, a brief pause, a slight adjustment in posture, and a response that demonstrated awareness of expected emotional content without actually containing any genuine emotion. "I've thought about how the family must be suffering," Nathan stated, his voice modulated to convey appropriate seriousness. "Losing a child is obviously devastating for parents." Thompson noted that Nathan's statement was abstract rather than specific, a general acknowledgement of parental grief rather than any recognition of Diego as an individual child or the specific suffering of Miguel, which had been the central purpose of the murder. Recognizing this pattern of intellectual recognition without emotional connection, Thompson took a more direct approach. "Nathan, throughout this case, from our first interview through trial, and now, I've observed that you approach these discussions differently than most people your age, or even most adults in similar circumstances. You engage with the psychological theory, the strategic elements, but show limited connection to the human impact. I'm curious about your perspective on that observation." This more direct assessment produced the most authentic engagement Thompson had witnessed from Nathan throughout their interactions, a momentary expression of what appeared to be genuine interest rather than calculated response. "Most people are governed by emotional reactions," Nathan stated, leaning forward as he shifted into the analytical mode where he appeared most comfortable. "They make decisions based on immediate feelings rather than strategic assessment of outcomes. I've always found that inefficient." Thompson recognized this response as a rare moment of authentic self-disclosure, encouraging this line of conversation with thoughtful engagement rather than judgment. "When did you first notice this difference between yourself and others?" Thompson asked, genuinely curious about the developmental trajectory that had led to Nathan's unusual psychological profile. "Early elementary school," Nathan responded without hesitation, his typical guardedness temporarily lowered by the opportunity to discuss his self-perceived exceptionalism. Other children would become distraught over minor setbacks, losing games, broken toys, perceived slights. I observed that their emotional reactions often prevented them from addressing the actual problem effectively. Nathan described how he had learned to mimic expected emotional responses while internally maintaining what he called rational assessment, a pattern that had become increasingly sophisticated as he moved through adolescence. Thompson listened with professional interest, recognizing that Nathan was essentially describing the development of cognitive patterns consistent with antisocial personality features, the observation and mimicry of expected emotional responses without genuine emotional experience, the strategic approach to social interactions, the fundamental view of others as pieces to be manipulated rather than individuals with inherent value. Most significantly, Nathan described these patterns not as problems to be addressed, but as adaptive advantages that set him apart from emotionally reactive peers. As their conversation continued, Thompson guided it toward Nathan's understanding of his actions against the Sanchez family, phrasing questions carefully to allow Nathan to engage theoretically without requiring direct admission of guilt. In your view, what would be the most sophisticated form of revenge against someone who had humiliated you publicly? Thompson asked, creating space for Nathan to discuss the psychological strategy behind Diego's murder while maintaining his technical denial of responsibility. Nathan engaged with this theoretical framing immediately, his expression showing the same intellectual pride Thompson had observed when discussing revenge psychology in their previous interviews. The truly sophisticated approach recognizes that physical harm is temporary and limited, Nathan explained, his voice taking on a didactic quality. Psychological damage, properly executed, creates permanent, irreparable harm that the target must live with continuously. Thompson noted how Nathan's vocabulary and analysis became more sophisticated when discussing these concepts, revealing both his intellectual capacity and his fundamental view of human suffering as a strategic tool rather than a moral boundary. Most revealing was Nathan's unprompted elaboration on the specific mechanics of psychological revenge. Identifying what someone truly values and systematically destroying it creates far more lasting damage than direct action against the person themselves, particularly if that valued element is something they feel responsible for protecting. The guilt becomes a self-sustaining mechanism that continues the damage indefinitely without requiring further action from the original agent. This clinical description of the exact psychological strategy employed in Diego's murder, targeting Miguel's younger brother, whom he felt responsible for protecting, was delivered with evident intellectual satisfaction, despite Nathan's continued technical denial of having implemented this strategy himself. Thompson maintained his professional demeanor throughout this disturbing exposition, recognizing that Nathan was inadvertently revealing his ongoing pride in the psychological sophistication of his crime while believing he was simply demonstrating his theoretical understanding. When Thompson asked about potential rehabilitation or treatment programs, Nathan's response was equally revealing. He described various therapeutic interventions available in the prison system not as opportunities for personal growth or emotional development, but as programs to complete for parole consideration, viewing them instrumentally rather than transformatively. As their interview approached its conclusion, Thompson asked a final question that had troubled him throughout the case. Nathan, regardless of legal outcomes or prison programs, do you believe you would make different choices if faced with similar situations in the future? The question deliberately avoided asking about remorse or guilt, instead focusing on behavioral change independent of emotional processing. Nathan's response was perhaps the most genuinely concerning element of their entire interaction. After a thoughtful pause that suggested actual consideration rather than calculated performance, Nathan replied, "I would make more effective strategic choices based on what I've learned from this experience." Thompson noted that this answer contained no reference to moral reconsideration, empathic development, or recognition of human cost, only a commitment to more effective strategy in future decision-making, implicitly acknowledging that his core approach to resolving conflicts through calculated harm remained unchanged. As Thompson concluded the interview and watched Nathan being escorted back to his cell block, he reflected on what he had observed, not just during this final conversation, but throughout the entire investigation from the discovery of Diego's body through trial and sentencing. Nathan Cooper represented something that the legal system struggled to adequately address, a defendant whose chronological age suggested diminished culpability due to adolescent brain development, but whose psychological makeup allowed for a level of calculated cruelty and absence of empathy rarely seen even in adult offenders. Thompson completed his final report on the case later that day, documenting his observations from the prison interview alongside his overall assessment of the investigation. This report would remain in the case file, potentially informing future parole hearings when Nathan became eligible for consideration after serving his minimum 25-year sentence. Thompson included his professional opinion that despite Nathan's young age at the time of Diego's murder, his psychological profile suggested ongoing risk factors that traditional rehabilitation programs might not adequately address. 1 month later, Thompson received notification that Nathan had been transferred to a specialized juvenile facility in another state, the result of his parents' continued legal efforts to secure more favorable conditions during the early years of his sentence. The facility focused on education and psychological treatment for juvenile offenders with elevated intelligence, providing structured programming designed to address antisocial tendencies while continuing academic development. Thompson noted the irony that the Coopers' wealth and connections, which had initially been deployed to shield Nathan from consequences, were now being leveraged to secure him the most progressive incarceration options available, opportunities unavailable to most juvenile offenders from less privileged backgrounds. Thompson's professional involvement with the case officially ended with this transfer, but his thoughts occasionally returned to Nathan Cooper in the years that followed, particularly when similar cases involving calculated violence by adolescents crossed his desk. The detective recognized that Nathan represented a challenging intersection of legal, developmental, and psychological questions. A teenager with the chronological and neurological characteristics of adolescence, but the calculated cruelty and absence of empathy more typical of adult psychopathology. 5 years after Nathan's conviction, Thompson received a letter forwarded through the department from Miguel Sanchez, who had recently turned 20 and was preparing to begin college after several years of struggling with the psychological aftermath of his brother's murder. The letter thanked Thompson for his work on the case and shared that Miguel had begun studying psychology, motivated by a desire to understand the factors that had led Nathan Cooper to target his brother and to eventually help other families affected by violence. "I still think about Diego every day," Miguel wrote toward the end of his letter. "But I'm trying to create something meaningful from what happened, to honor him by helping others rather than being destroyed by what Nathan did to our family. That seems like the only real victory possible over someone who wanted to break me completely." Thompson was struck by the wisdom and resilience in these words from a young man who had experienced trauma deliberately engineered to cause maximum psychological damage, yet had found a path toward healing and purpose despite that calculated cruelty. Thompson contrasted Miguel's journey with what he knew of Nathan Cooper, who continued his education in detention through correspondence courses in psychology, law, and computer science, maintaining exemplary behavioral records and participating in all required treatment programs, external compliance that satisfied institutional metrics while providing little evidence of genuine emotional or empathic development. Nathan's appellate attorneys continued pursuing legal strategies focused on his age at the time of the crime, filing appeals based on evolving standards for juvenile sentencing that might eventually reduce his 25-year minimum term. The final notification Thompson received regarding the case came 10 years after Diego Sanchez's murder, when the Supreme Court declined to hear a constitutional challenge to Nathan's sentence brought by his appellate team, effectively exhausting his direct appeals. The accompanying case summary noted that Nathan, now 26 years old, had completed multiple academic degrees during his incarceration and was developing a specialized computer program to optimize psychological intervention strategies for juvenile offenders, a project that prison administrators viewed as evidence of rehabilitation, while Thompson recognized it as consistent with Nathan's fundamental approach to human psychology as a system to be analyzed and manipulated rather than experienced. On the 10th anniversary of Diego's death, Thompson visited the memorial garden created at Riverside Elementary School, a peaceful space featuring a dinosaur sculpture in honor of Diego's passion for paleontology and benches where students could read or reflect. The detective stood quietly observing children playing on the same playground where Diego Sanchez had been murdered a decade earlier, their laughter and energy a poignant contrast to the tragedy that had occurred there. A small group of teachers and community members held a brief remembrance ceremony, laying flowers at the base of the dinosaur sculpture and sharing memories of the bright, curious 8-year-old whose life had been cut short as part of a calculated act of psychological revenge. As Thompson left the memorial garden, he reflected on the enduring impact of a crime that had begun with a teenage boy's humiliation in a high school hallway and escalated through calculated planning to the murder of an innocent child. The case had challenged conventional understandings of juvenile crime, raising difficult questions about the intersection of adolescent brain development and fundamental psychopathology, about legal frameworks for culpability and psychological frameworks for rehabilitation. Most significantly, it had demonstrated the profound ripple effects of calculated violence, not just the immediate loss of Diego's life, but the transformation of his family, the community's shattered sense of safety, and the ongoing questions about whether someone like Nathan Cooper could ever truly understand the human cost of his actions or develop the empathy that might prevent similar calculations in the future. The judge's unusual words at sentencing, "I want to see you die in prison," had revealed the profound impact Nathan's case had on even experienced legal professionals, the recognition that some crimes transcend standard frameworks for juvenile justice because they reveal patterns of calculated cruelty that age alone cannot explain or mitigate. As Nathan Cooper continued serving his sentence, maintaining perfect institutional compliance while showing limited evidence of emotional or empathic development, Thompson understood that the final chapter of this story remained unwritten, the question of whether someone who had calculated the murder of a child as the perfect psychological revenge could ever truly be considered rehabilitated, regardless of academic achievements or behavioral compliance during incarceration. In his final reflection on the case, Thompson recognized that while the legal system had held Nathan accountable through conviction and sentencing, the deeper questions raised by his actions and psychological makeup remained incompletely addressed by existing frameworks for juvenile justice. The detective had encountered many teenage offenders who had committed serious crimes through impulsivity, peer pressure, or environmental factors, all patterns consistent with adolescent brain development and responsive to appropriate intervention. Nathan Cooper represented something fundamentally different, a calculated cruelty and absence of empathy that transcended age, raising profound questions about rehabilitation potential and future risk that would eventually face the parole board, tasked with considering his release after serving his minimum 25 years sentence. As Thompson drove away from Riverside Elementary School for the final time, he carried with him the enduring image of two brothers, Diego Sanchez, whose life had been cut short at 8 years old as part of a calculated revenge strategy, and Miguel Sanchez, who had survived the psychological torture intended to break him completely and found a path toward meaning and purpose despite that deliberate cruelty. This contrast represented the fundamental truth at the heart of the case, that while calculated violence might cause profound suffering, the human capacity for resilience and healing remained a powerful counterforce to even the most sophisticated strategies of psychological harm, a reality that Nathan Cooper, for all his intellectual analysis of human psychology, had fundamentally failed to incorporate into his calculations.